Hey guys, tonight we step quietly back into a century that is not remembered with much warmth. The 1300s, a span of years so dense with hardship that even those accustomed to toil, hunger, and uncertainty felt the world growing heavier around them. This was not a time of sudden catastrophe alone, but of constant strain, a slow, unyielding grind that pressed down on every life from the lowliest field worker to the wealthiest noble. Before we settle in, take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Maybe dim the room so that shadows pool in the corners, or let a gentle fan hum in the background, carrying a steady rhythm beneath the words. And if you find yourself returning to these quiet wanderings through history, feel free to follow along so you don't miss the next. It's always a strange comfort to see where and when you're listening from, scattered across so many different places and hours. Now, breathe slowly, let your shoulders loosen. Picture the world without the hum of traffic, without the glow of screens, without the conveniences that frame your day. Instead, see the narrow rutted roads of the 14th century, the smoke curling from small hearth fires, the fields stretching out in shades of grey and brown under a restless sky. Hear the low murmur of voices speaking of harvests, of weather, of taxes and illness, voices shaped by a life where every comfort had a cost. Tonight, we will walk, not rush, through this century. We will see the cold winters and the lean years, the cramped dwellings and the endless work, the weight of disease and superstition, and the quiet persistence that kept life moving forward despite it all. So, let's set the scene. We begin not with a single year, but with the feeling of a whole century, its weight, its silence, and the small sounds that filled it. The century opened not with a blaze of change, but with the same slow rhythm that had carried the world for generations. In the year 1300, the known world was vast in its variety, yet strangely similar in its foundations. From the damp villages of northern Europe to the sun-baked fields of the Middle East, and across the crowded markets of Asia, life was overwhelmingly agricultural, rural, and dictated by forces beyond the control of ordinary people. The vast majority of humanity tilled the soil, not as a choice but as a necessity. Wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a few, while the rest labored in the shadow of systems so deeply entrenched they were as immovable as the seasons themselves. In Europe, kingdoms rose and fell, yet the life of the peasant changed little from one reign to the next. The land was divided into estates, each a small universe where the Lord's will was law, and where rents, duties and obligations bound families to the same soil for centuries. The architecture of these societies was not built on freedom or mobility, but on the idea that each person's place was fixed, ordained by custom, and reinforced by both secular law and the word of the Church. In Asia, empires stretched across deserts and mountains, their rulers commanding armies and trade networks, yet even here, the hum of daily life was that of farming and barter. In the Middle East, the legacy of earlier Islamic golden ages still lingered in cities of learning and commerce, but beyond the gates of those cities, the same struggle to wrest grain from the earth persisted. Few people saw more than a day's walk beyond their homes, and the idea of the wider world was carried to them in the form of traveling merchants, monks, or soldiers, each with tales that blurred fact and myth. The century's weight came not from a single calamity, but from its unyielding sameness. Every life was tethered to the land's capacity to produce. A dry season could mean hunger, a wet one could mean rot, and a pest infestation could mean the thin margin between subsistence and starvation vanished altogether. The tools available to till, sow and reap were little improved from those of centuries past. Wooden ploughs, iron-tipped where fortune allowed, pulled by oxen whose pace was as steady as it was slow. The rhythm of life followed the calendar of nature, yet nature's generosity was fickle. Faith was both anchor and chain. In much of Europe, the Catholic Church was the ultimate arbiter of truth, law, and morality. Its rituals marked the passage of time, its festivals offering brief pauses in an otherwise unbroken chain of labor. The same was true in other parts of the world, where religious institutions, whether Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, or others, shaped the moral fabric of society, offering explanations for suffering that kept people tethered to their place in the world. Misfortunes were not random, they were signs, punishments, or tests. The invisible was as real as the visible. The cities of the 14th century, though few compared to the vast countryside, were not the bustling metropolises of modern imagination. Streets were narrow, buildings leaned toward one another as if conspiring against the sky, and the air was thick with smoke from hearth fires and the stench of refuse. Craftsmen worked in dim workshops, their trades passed down through strict apprenticeships. Markets overflowed with goods, salted fish, rough cloth, earthenware, and spices in the rare places that trade routes touched. Yet even here, life was hard, and the poor crowded into alleys where light rarely reached. Across all these regions, the boundaries of possibility were narrow. A child born to a farmer almost certainly became a farmer. The same was true for the child of a cobbler, a fisherman, or a herdsman. Upward mobility was so rare that it was spoken of in the same breath as miracles. Social hierarchies were reinforced by the scarcity of education. Books were precious, and literacy was the domain of the clergy, scholars, and the very wealthy. Even in the more cosmopolitan centers, knowledge traveled slowly, carried in the minds of those who could afford both the leisure and the means to learn. War was ever present in the background, though not always as a constant roar. Sometimes it was a distant rumor, other times it was the sound of hoofbeats on the road, the smell of burning thatch, and the sudden appearance of soldiers demanding supplies. Alliances shifted, borders blurred, and in every case it was the common people who bore the heaviest burdens, their fields trampled, their grain taken, their sons conscripted. It is easy, from a modern vantage, to imagine the 14th century as a simpler time. But simplicity in this context meant exposure. It meant no barrier between a family and the elements, no safety net when the harvest failed, no guarantee that a winter illness could be survived. It meant lives lived within the same few square miles, marked by the same unchanging sights, the slow plough, the church spire, the Lord's manor on the hill, the fields stretching toward the edge of the known. And yet, there was resilience in this world. People adapted to scarcity, found moments of rest in feast days and gatherings, shared labor and food when they could. Stories were told by firelight, songs carried across fields, and rituals gave meaning to the repetition of the seasons. But the baseline of existence remained one of labor, duty, and the constant awareness that any tilt of fortune, weather, war, disease, could undo the fragile balance. The century did not yet know the calamities that lay ahead, though they were already gathering on the horizon. For now, life pressed forward in its measured, grinding pace, dictated by forces older than any kingdom. The land itself was the great clock, its seasons both ruler and oppressor, setting the terms to which every life had to bend, shaping not only the daily routine but the very possibility of survival. The fields awaited their planting, the skies their turn to shift, and with them came the unspoken understanding that the natural world could be as cruel as any human hand. That understanding would be tested soon enough, as the century's weather began to twist against its people. The weather in the 14th century was not a passing inconvenience. It was the single most decisive force in the lives of ordinary people. Every year was a negotiation with the land, and the terms were dictated by the sky. Winters could arrive early, gripping the soil in frost before the last of the autumn's work was finished. They could linger long past their welcome, delaying planting and eating away at dwindling stores of grain. In many places the cold was not just uncomfortable but lethal, seeping through the thin walls of cottages, freezing water in buckets, and stiffening fingers too quickly for them to complete their tasks. Snowfall, though often romanticized in later centuries, was more a burden than a beauty. A deep snow could mean impassable roads, trapping villages in isolation for weeks. It could collapse thatched roofs under its weight, block the paths to water sources, and force people to burn through precious firewood faster than they could replace it. In years when the woodpile was too small, families huddled together, relying on body heat as much as on the hearth. When spring did come, it did not always bring relief. The thaw could turn roads into rivers of mud, sucking at the feet of those who had to walk them. Rains could flood newly ploughed fields, drowning seeds before they could germinate. Even in good years the planting season was a frantic race against time. Every day lost could mean a poorer harvest months later. Farmers knew their land intimately, but they had no control over the weather's whims. A late frost could kill seedlings overnight, erasing weeks of labor. Summers brought their own uncertainties. In years of gentle warmth and steady rain, crops might thrive, but such seasons were rare enough to be remembered for decades afterward. More often, heat waves dried the soil to dust, leaving young plants stunted. Sudden storms could flatten entire fields, tearing through grain heads just as they ripened. Lightning could set thatch alight, and wind could scatter months of growth in a single night. There was no insurance, no compensation, only the slow grinding knowledge that the harvest might not be enough. The growing season was short in much of Europe, especially in the north, where cool temperatures and poor soils made farming a delicate balance. Farmers planted as soon as the ground could be worked, and they harvested as soon as crops were ready, aware that autumn's chill could come early. In the highlands and more marginal lands, frost could appear even in summer, a reminder that nature's boundaries were fixed and unforgiving. The Middle East and parts of Asia faced different extremes: arid lands where water was life, and where irrigation systems were vital but vulnerable. A single break in a canal could wither fields in days. Drought could linger for years, forcing migrations, sparking conflict and emptying once prosperous villages. Monsoon rains, where they came, could be both blessing and curse. Too little, and the earth cracked too much, and the fields dissolved into stagnant pools where disease bred. Everywhere, the margin between sufficiency and famine was razor thin. A single failed harvest might be endured, with grain borrowed or bought from neighboring regions. Two failed harvests could break a community. The price of food would rise sharply, and those with little to trade found themselves selling possessions, livestock, or even their labor for years ahead, simply to survive. Hunger weakened bodies, making them more vulnerable to disease. Children grew slowly, if at all. The old and the very young died first, quietly reducing the mouths to feed. Even in years of plenty, food could never be entirely secure. Grain stores were vulnerable to damp, to rot, and to rats, whose constant gnawing could destroy sacks before they were needed. Meat, unless salted or smoked, spoiled quickly. Milk soured in the heat, and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, disappearing for months at a time. A good harvest meant breathing room. It did not mean abundance. These challenges were compounded by the fact that farming in the 14th century was still largely dependent on human and animal muscle. Heavy plows required strong oxen or horses, and their care demanded a share of the harvest. Tools were crude and often handmade, wearing out faster than they could be replaced. Iron was costly, wooden parts splintered and warped. Every step of the process, from turning the soil to binding the sheaves, was labor-intensive, leaving no day truly free from work. The people of the 1300s understood the land not as a possession, but as a force to be endured. They read the sky as carefully as any scripture, scanning for signs in cloud shapes and wind patterns. Folklore and superstition filled the gaps where knowledge ended, planting on certain days of the moon, blessing fields with holy water, avoiding certain tasks when omens were bad. These rituals provided a sense of control, however illusory, over a world that could turn against them without warning. In the north, the long, dark winters shaped not only work, but also the mind. Time seemed to slow when snow lay deep, the days compressed into short bursts of light. People gathered indoors, repairing tools, spinning wool, telling stories to pass the hours. In warmer lands, the heat dictated its own rhythm, forcing work into the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. But in both extremes, the environment was never forgotten. It was the constant presence, the unspoken partner in every human endeavor. The century's climate was already shifting. Subtle changes in temperature and rainfall patterns hinted at what modern historians would later call the onset of the Little Ice Age. For those living through it, there was no name, only the slow realization that winters were biting harder, summers were shorter, and the balance on which their lives depended was tilting. What had once been difficult was becoming harder still, and so each year was measured, not by calendars on a wall, but by the success or failure of the fields. People did not speak of years as good or bad in abstract terms. They remembered them in loaves baked, in cattle fattened, in whether there was grain enough to last until the next harvest. Time itself was agricultural, and in that measure, A year could be generous or cruel. It was in this world, bounded by fields, ruled by weather, that people bent their backs to the earth each day, knowing that the seasons did not negotiate. They would rise and work because not working was unthinkable, and with each turn of the plough, they lived with the knowledge that the harvest was still months away, and that nothing was certain until the last sheaf was cut. Yet this uncertainty was accepted, because there was no alternative. The land gave, and the land withheld, and humanity's role was to endure. As the first shoots pushed through the soil each spring, there was a fragile hope, but hope in this age was never free from the shadow of hunger, a shadow that deepened whenever the soil turned against its keepers, demanding yet more toil from bodies already worn thin. Even in years when the seasons were favorable, survival depended on the unbroken labor of those who worked the land. From the moment dawn touched the horizon, the fields demanded attention. Children learned to walk alongside the adults, carrying small bundles of straw, or helping with simple tasks long before they fully understood the concept of a day's work. Their small hands were calloused almost as soon as they could grasp a tool, and their backs bent under burdens that would have crushed an untrained adult. Labor began early, ended late, and repeated itself day after day, month after month, year after year, forming a rhythm that marked the passage of life as much as the rising and setting of the sun. The plough, though seemingly simple, was a heavy instrument of labor. In northern and central Europe, soils were dense and clay-laden, often hard enough to resist penetration, even by a pair of strong oxen. Men guided the plough through furrows, feeling every jerk and obstruction as though the earth itself was resisting their intrusion. The plough's iron tip could cut into frozen soil only when assisted by careful heating or repeated strikes with hammer and mallet, a time-consuming task that slowed planting and required strength and skill, as the oxen strained to drag the implement forward. The ploughman's hands were perpetually raw, his shoulders tight, and his feet hardened from standing in mud or frost. Sowing followed ploughing, and it was no less demanding. Grain was scattered by hand, spread evenly across prepared fields in precise amounts to ensure maximum yield. Too little seed, and the harvest would fail too much, and the plants would compete, weakening each other. This work required not only physical endurance but constant attention and judgment, honed over years of experience. Fields had to be monitored, weeds removed, and young shoots protected from pests and birds, each task taking its toll in sweat and time. Harvesting was both a relief and another burden. Sickles and scythes cut through heavy stalks of grain, and bundles had to be carried to drying stacks or granaries. Women, children, and men alike carried, bent and lifted. Hands blistered, shoulders ached, and the sun pressed down relentlessly during peak summer months. Any break in this labor could result in loss. Grain left in the field could rot or be eaten by animals. The harvest was not merely a moment of reward. It was the culmination of months of unyielding toil, and failure was always a possibility. The work extended far beyond ploughing and sowing. Fields had to be fertilized, a process that often meant hauling manure across long distances. Irrigation channels required maintenance. Stones had to be removed from plough lines. Fences and hedges needed repair. Every day brought a new task, and every task demanded strength and precision. Mistakes were costly, and the consequences fell hardest on those with the least resilience. For children, this meant early apprenticeship in labor that would dominate their adult lives. For adults, it was the unrelenting repetition that bent their spines and knotted their muscles, leaving bodies shaped by necessity rather than leisure. Even the rhythm of rest was dictated by the sun and the seasons. Long hours of daylight allowed more work, but short days in winter left fields idle while households still required attention. Mealtimes were brief and functional, providing only enough nourishment to sustain further labor. Sleep was a precious commodity, yet even it was influenced by the farm. Tending animals through the night, guarding stored grain, and performing household chores left little room for full recovery. The human body adapted, hardened by repeated stress, yet even the strongest could be worn down by the cumulative weight of decades of labor. Labor was further intensified by the tools themselves. Simple though they were, wooden handles splintered, iron edges dulled, and repairs were constant. Oxen and horses, necessary for moving heavy loads, required feeding, grooming, and care. A single sick animal could cripple the productivity of a farm for weeks. Every piece of equipment and every living worker had to be maintained, and failure to do so threatened the subsistence of entire families. Beyond the physical strain, there was a constant psychological burden. Each season was a gamble, and the people understood that failure could have catastrophic consequences. A frost, a drought, a pest infestation, or even the theft of a portion of the harvest could leave a family with insufficient food. Anxiety was embedded into the daily rhythm, quiet but pervasive, shaping decisions about how much seed to sow, how many animals to keep, and how best to ration dwindling resources. The mind, like the body, learned to bear weight as part of survival. Children's education, if it existed at all, was secondary to this unending cycle. They learned from watching elders, from the repetition of tasks, and from the strict instructions of parents who themselves had never known leisure. Skills were passed down, but not theories or abstractions. Life was practical, immediate, and relentlessly focused on survival. There was little room for curiosity beyond what was needed to coax productivity from the soil. The work did not end with the fields themselves. Seasonal chores carried over into the household, tending livestock, mending clothes, preserving food, and preparing firewood. Each of these tasks connected back to survival on the land. A neglected chicken could mean less meat or eggs. A torn garment could expose a body to frost. A failed granary repair could result in months of lost harvest. Every day was full, and every day carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate labor. Even within communities, there was no escaping the weight of the fields. Villages were built near arable land, so neighbors were constantly aware of each other's labor and productivity. Fields were often worked in cooperation, with families assisting one another during sowing and harvest, but this cooperation was itself a form of obligation. No family could shirk their duties without social censure, or in some cases punitive measures from local authorities. Labor was thus not only physical, but social, a constant performance of adequacy within the expectations of both human and natural law. And so the 14th century person lived largely in relation to their labor, their body, and the ever-changing land. Days were measured in work cycles rather than hours. Weeks in tasks completed rather than celebrations. Life's rhythms were tied irrevocably to soil and weather, and the weight of centuries of tradition reinforced the inevitability of this labor. Only when night fell and work ceased, or when storms forced a pause, could the body truly rest, though the mind remained aware of the responsibilities waiting at dawn. The burden of the fields was not a temporary stage of life, but the central reality for nearly all, shaping bodies, communities, and expectations. In this it also shaped the dwellings where people sought refuge, the very small spaces where families slept, cooked, and survived the unrelenting cycle of work. The exhaustion of labor determined the way homes were built, what they contained, and how inhabitants interacted with each other, for comfort and practicality were inseparable from necessity. After the long day spent in the fields, the peasants returned to dwellings that offered little relief from the strain of labor. Their homes were modest in the extreme, constructed from wattle and daub, timber or stone when available, yet rarely providing insulation or comfort. Roofs of thatch often leaked in rainstorms, and walls were thin enough that the sounds of neighbors, livestock, and wind penetrated readily. Even the simplest domestic space was dark. Small shuttered windows let in little light, and the interior depended on a single hearth for illumination. Smoke rose from fires that had no proper chimneys, curling through cracks in the roof or escaping through gaps in walls. The air was thick with the combination of smoke, cooking odors, and the persistent smell of damp straw, creating a haze that clung to skin, hair, and clothing. Floors were commonly made of compacted earth, sometimes strewn with straw to provide a slight cushion and insulation. This straw, however, was rarely clean. It absorbed water, animal waste, and the odors of daily life, turning the very ground on which people walked and slept into a constant reminder of scarcity and hard work. Families slept on raised platforms or simple mats atop the floor, often sharing space with young children, and in some cases domestic animals. Heat was generated primarily by the fire, and while it offered a measure of comfort, it could not fully dispel the cold that seeped through walls in winter. The close quarters amplified not only warmth but also the smells and discomforts of human life pressed together, and privacy was a luxury almost entirely unknown. Furniture, where it existed, was minimal. A few stools or benches, a table perhaps, and some rudimentary storage chests. Beds were rudimentary, composed of straw mattresses or simple pallets. Blankets were rare, and during the coldest months, families huddled together for warmth. In the corner, a small hearth served both cooking and heating purposes, and its smoke coiled through the room unchecked, leaving a grey film on walls and ceilings. The air was heavy, carrying soot and particles that irritated lungs and eyes. Illness, while not fully understood, was made more likely by these conditions, as warmth and ventilation were both insufficient. The layout of a peasant home was dictated by necessity and efficiency. Cooking, sleeping, and daily chores all took place in the same confined area, with little separation of spaces. The hearth was central, both physically and socially, around which the family's life revolved. Food was prepared in a manner that conserved fuel and labor, and small children were often present during all tasks, learning domestic routines even as they were expected to perform them. By night, these same spaces became bedrooms for everyone, with bedding shifted or rolled to make room for the collective rest of the household. Animals were often accommodated within the dwelling itself, or in attached lean-tos, particularly in colder regions where they could not survive outdoors. Chickens, pigs, goats, or a single cow might share a corner of the home, providing warmth, security, and quick access to food or labor. This arrangement, though practical, compounded the odors and the unsanitary conditions of the interior, and the constant presence of animals created a backdrop of noise, pests, and the need for vigilance. Mice and rats were omnipresent, gnawing at stored grain or infiltrating the straw beds. Fleas and lice were common irritations, feeding on both humans and animals indiscriminately. Sanitation was minimal. Human waste was typically deposited in outdoor latrines, though these could be little more than pits dug at a short distance from the dwelling, and in inclement weather, care was taken to avoid contamination of water sources. Water was drawn from nearby wells, rivers, or streams, often with the knowledge that the same water might also serve as a source of illness. Bathing was infrequent. People washed their faces and hands, sometimes their feet, but the cold and the labor involved made full bathing an occasional luxury at best. Clothing, too, was infrequently laundered, and odors from work, animals, and infrequent washing lingered persistently. Storage was likewise minimal. Grain and other staples were often kept in small bins or sacks within the dwelling, vulnerable to moisture, rodents, and spoilage. Preservation methods were basic: salting, smoking, drying, and occasionally pickling, but these could not compensate for the unpredictability of supply. Families relied heavily on whatever they could grow or acquire locally, and a poor harvest meant that both storage and sustenance were immediately threatened. The constant proximity to smoke, dirt, and dampness shaped not only the physical experience of these dwellings, but also the mental and emotional environment. Life was lived in a haze of odors and shadows, punctuated by the occasional brightness of daylight or the crackle of the hearth. The limitations of space meant that family interactions were intense, continuous, and unavoidable. Social bonds were reinforced in these cramped quarters, but so too were irritations and tensions, as individuals had little opportunity to retreat from the demands of domestic and agricultural life. Even the smallest comforts were tied directly to survival. Blankets, when available, were shared carefully. Food preparation was efficient and frugal, and every tool had a designated place for immediate access. Children learned quickly that the home was not simply a space for rest but a site of ongoing labor, planning, and vigilance. Observation of the rhythms of life in these dwellings was an early education in responsibility and endurance, training each generation for the unrelenting demands of the fields outside. Despite the hardship, there was a quiet resilience. People found ways to mark the passage of time with simple domestic rituals, to teach children through example, and to carve moments of rest into an otherwise exhausting existence. Yet the very design of these spaces, with their smoke-filled interiors, dirt floors, and close quarters with animals and people alike, reinforced the sense that comfort and ease were temporary, rare, and subordinate to survival. It was within these walls that people ate, slept, and planned their next day, perpetually aware that the world outside would test them again, with weather, pests, or misfortune. Every aspect of dwelling life was inseparable from the land they worked, and the seasons they endured. The body carried the fatigue of labor into the home, and the mind carried the awareness of scarcity. Rest was never fully restful. Sleep offered only a temporary reprieve from the physical, mental, and environmental burdens of existence. And so, as the family huddled by the hearth at night, the immediate worries of space, smoke, and dampness merged with the pressing question of sustenance. What they ate, how much they ate, and whether the coming days would bring enough to survive were central concerns. The dwelling, humble as it was, became a nexus of survival, where the physical strain of labor intersected with the ever-present uncertainty of nourishment, forming the backdrop for the next pressing reality of medieval life: the scarcity and monotony of food, and the ever-present threat of hunger. In the 14th century, sustenance was a persistent concern, not a fleeting choice. Every meal was a reminder of labor, luck, and scarcity, and the act of eating carried with it more weight than mere nourishment. In times of relative abundance, a household might manage to secure a basic variety of food: coarse, dark bread, made from barley, rye, or wheat, a thin pottage of grains or legumes boiled with water, herbs, and the occasional vegetable, and if fortune allowed, salted or smoked meat. Eggs, milk, and cheese appeared irregularly, often limited to small quantities, and even then they were treated as valuable supplements rather than staples. Sweetness was rare, with honey, when available, representing both luxury and rarity. Bread, the central component of most diets, was coarse and heavy, a far cry from modern expectations. Milling was rudimentary, grinding stones leaving much of the bran intact, resulting in dense loaves that required careful chewing. The grain itself was vulnerable to weather, pests, and storage failures, so even in times of harvest, quality varied dramatically. Pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, or occasionally meat, was often the same meal consumed day after day, a monotonous repetition that required little skill but provided sustenance. In the absence of spices or fresh ingredients, the flavor was bland, and the monotony was endured with stoicism rather than complaint. Meat, a highly prized commodity, was seldom available to peasants. Pigs, chickens, and goats were raised primarily for survival, rather than indulgence, and slaughtering them required careful timing, both for preservation and necessity. Salted meat, cured to extend its shelf life, was tough and heavily flavored, a substance as much for survival as for taste. Fresh meat was a rare treat, generally reserved for feast days or when hunting yielded unexpected results. Fish, when accessible through rivers or coastal areas, was another occasional addition, though preservation remained a challenge in warmer months. The availability of food was inextricably tied to the land and seasons, and scarcity was ever present. When crops failed, when rainfall was too low, or storms washed away seeds, famine loomed. Bread became thinner, pottage thinner still, and the portions smaller. Hunger was a shadow that stretched across the day, influencing work, sleep, and the energy required to maintain life itself. Families rationed carefully, often prioritizing children and the elderly, while adults endured longer periods without full nourishment. Nutritional deficiency was common, and bodies weakened gradually under the cumulative stress of insufficient sustenance. Grain stores were never secure. They could be infested with pests, mold, or rot, and theft was always a concern. Stored food was the difference between survival and calamity, and managing it required vigilance and effort. Families learned to preserve what they could through drying, smoking, or salting, yet these methods were only partially effective. The uncertainty of provision shaped daily life, dictating when and how food was prepared, and creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Water, too, was a critical factor in sustenance. Clean water was not guaranteed, and wells, rivers and streams were often shared with animals or contaminated by runoff. Boiling water was a labor-intensive precaution, and even then, illness could not always be prevented. People drank cautiously, ate sparingly, and adjusted their habits to the limits imposed by the environment. The act of eating was never entirely comforting. It was practical, functional, and governed by necessity rather than pleasure. The scarcity of food had social and economic implications. Markets offered some relief, allowing peasants to trade produce, labor, or small sums of coin for goods they could not produce themselves. Yet the prices fluctuated wildly with the harvest, and those with little wealth were often left with nothing. Reliance on external trade created vulnerability. A distant poor harvest could ripple through the economy, inflating costs and threatening subsistence. Communities were tightly knit, not only for social reasons but also for mutual survival. Sharing and assistance were means to buffer the harshness of scarcity. Hunger shaped both the body and the mind. Underfed individuals were prone to fatigue, making labor in the fields more difficult and perpetuating the cycle of scarcity. Children grew slowly, were more susceptible to disease, and often began work earlier, contributing to the family's survival. Adults carried the strain of inadequate nutrition into every task, and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, weakened by years of hardship. Malnutrition was a slow, cumulative form of suffering, less visible than violent death, but equally decisive in shaping daily existence. Even in periods of adequate harvest, monotony was inescapable. Daily meals were repetitive, constrained by what could be grown, stored or preserved. Culinary diversity was limited, and flavor was secondary to survival. Preparation required fuel, time and labor, all in short supply. Eating was a structured, functional act, often carried out in the same crowded dwellings that amplified odors and discomfort. The very act of consuming food was closely linked to the household economy, preserving resources, preparing for the next day, and ensuring that each member of the family received at least the minimum necessary. In times of famine, the reality was more severe. Communities faced mass starvation when consecutive poor harvests occurred, or when crops failed catastrophically due to weather, pests or disease. People turned to foraging for roots, wild plants, and anything edible that could be found in fields or forests. Such food was often of poor quality, difficult to prepare, and insufficient to meet caloric needs. The psychological toll of persistent hunger was profound, contributing to despair, social tension and conflict even among neighbors who had previously cooperated. The scarcity of food was mirrored by scarcity in knowledge about nutrition, hygiene, and disease prevention. Without understanding the mechanisms of illness or the benefits of diet, communities relied on tradition and superstition. Remedies and rituals were employed, often in desperation, but the limits of available resources remained decisive. People endured, adapting practices to the realities of what was available and what could be harvested, hunted, or traded. Thus, food in the 1300s was never simply a matter of taste or choice. It was a measurement of survival, a reflection of labor, luck, and social standing, and a constant source of anxiety and constraint. Even in the best years, it imposed limits on strength, opportunity, and health. And while the presence or absence of nourishment shaped every day, it also intersected with another, often invisible threat, the ever-present and pervasive influence of disease. The body weakened by hunger was more vulnerable to infection, making illness not just likely, but often fatal, and embedding a quiet dread that followed every family through each season. Even before the arrival of the plague, that would later become infamous as the Black Death, the 14th century was a world defined by sickness as much as by scarcity. Disease was an invisible authority, governing the rhythms of life with an unrelenting hand. The understanding of illness was limited and interwoven with religious and superstitious beliefs, meaning that prevention, diagnosis and treatment were rudimentary at best. The human body, already strained by constant labor and intermittent hunger, was a vulnerable host, exposed to pathogens that could exploit any weakness. Common illnesses ranged from fevers and respiratory infections to gastrointestinal disturbances. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, and influenza moved quietly through villages, often arriving with travelers or through contact with neighboring communities. For many, the progression of illness was swift. For others, it was prolonged, wearing down strength and leaving bodies frail and emaciated. Even the most minor afflictions could have significant consequences, as weakness reduced the ability to work in the fields, limiting both the immediate harvest and future sustenance. Parasites were an ever-present burden. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs infested homes, burrowing into clothing, bedding, and hair. Worms, including tapeworms and roundworms, inhabited the digestive tract, feeding on limited nutrition and causing fatigue, abdominal pain, and in severe cases, malnutrition or stunted growth. Animals living in close quarters with humans contributed to this problem, bringing disease vectors into the very space intended for rest and shelter. The presence of these parasites was a constant, low-grade discomfort, shaping daily behavior and contributing silently to the slow erosion of health. Hygiene was not a concept understood in the modern sense. Bathing was rare, often limited to infrequent immersion in rivers or public baths where they existed. Water sources were communal and easily contaminated, with no knowledge of bacteria or viruses to guide treatment. Clothes were seldom washed, and even when they were, drying and sun exposure were limited. Hands, faces, and utensils carried invisible threats, and the absence of proper waste management compounded the problem. Latrines were minimal, sometimes nothing more than simple pits a short distance from homes, and their proximity to wells or streams ensured that contamination could spread quickly through a village. Children were particularly vulnerable, malnourished, unvaccinated, and unprotected. They fell prey to diseases that adults might endure with difficulty. Mortality rates among infants and young children were high, a constant presence in the communal consciousness. Families expected some children to perish before adulthood, a quiet understanding that shaped social and emotional life. Those who survived were often small, weak, and early burdened with work, their bodies a testament to the endurance demanded by circumstance. Epidemics occurred with frightening regularity, though their causes were poorly understood. Localized outbreaks of dysentery, influenza, and other infectious diseases could wipe out portions of villages, leaving survivors to cope with both the loss of labor and the trauma of witnessing multiple deaths. Treatment was a mixture of herbal remedies, prayers, and ritual. Physicians, where available, relied on humoral theory, balancing blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, with little practical effect. Healing often depended on the patient's own constitution, the care of family members, and sheer luck. Seasonal shifts exacerbated vulnerability. Cold, damp winters increased respiratory infections, while hot, humid summers encouraged the spread of gastrointestinal illnesses and parasites. Flooding and stagnant water bred conditions ripe for disease, contaminating wells and leading to outbreaks of dysentery or cholera-like symptoms, though not understood in those terms. Even the most routine labor exposed people to pathogens. Handling animals, tending crops, and sharing living spaces ensured that sickness moved easily from one host to another. Nutrition played a critical role in susceptibility. A body weakened by hunger or a poor diet had fewer defenses against infection. Scarce protein, intermittent vitamins, and reliance on limited staples such as bread and pottage meant that even minor ailments could become dangerous. Iron deficiency, scurvy, and other deficiencies further undermined resistance. The cyclical connection between famine, weakness, and disease was unbroken, creating a persistent undercurrent of vulnerability. Religious and cultural interpretations of illness added layers of psychological burden. Disease was often considered divine punishment, a reflection of moral failing, or the influence of evil spirits. Rituals, prayers, charms, and pilgrimages were employed to ward off affliction, but they provided little physical relief. The lack of empirical understanding meant that communities could do little more than endure, adapt, and hope. This awareness that illness could strike without warning, and with little possibility of intervention, shaped behavior, social structure, and even settlement patterns. Villages and towns were in effect microcosms of contagion. Dense living conditions, combined with shared resources and limited hygiene, ensured that pathogens spread easily. Tradespeople, traveling merchants, and laborers Moving between settlements carried both wealth and disease. The very act of survival required constant exposure to risk. People accepted this as part of life, adjusting routines, spacing houses, and arranging work schedules with an implicit understanding that illness was inevitable, even if its timing was uncertain. Medical knowledge was localized and inconsistent. Midwives, herbalists, and local healers provided the majority of care. Remedies included infusions of herbs, poultices, bloodletting, and other treatments that often harmed as much as helped. Physicians trained in universities were few and largely restricted to cities, often focusing on the wealthy rather than peasants. Even the most learned practitioners operated under flawed theories and limited tools, leaving the bulk of the population to rely on practical experience, observation, and communal wisdom. Mortality from disease was constant but invisible, punctuated by occasional catastrophic outbreaks. Life was understood as fragile. Childhood survival, adult labor capacity, and old age were all provisional. Communities developed social mechanisms to support those afflicted, but the reality of high mortality imposed psychological stress on all ages. Fear of illness was as omnipresent as hunger or work, a quiet tyranny shaping decisions and behaviors every hour of every day. Thus, the tyranny of disease intersected with labor, scarcity, and environment to create a world where survival was contingent and fragile. Each cough, each fever, each visible symptom was both a personal threat and a communal reminder of vulnerability. Even before the great mortality events that would later define history, disease governed life in subtle but unrelenting ways. Bodies weakened, families strained, and communities remained aware that no effort in the fields or hearth could fully insulate them from the invisible forces of contagion and infirmity. And in this context, where malnutrition, overwork, and environmental hazards weakened bodies, the prospects for longevity were grim. Life expectancy was short, mortality rates high, and the passage from childhood to adulthood was fraught with hazard. Yet even the inevitability of death shaped the rhythms of life, as communities planned work, raised children, and conducted rituals with an acute awareness of fragility. These realities carried naturally into the next aspect of medieval life, the brevity of existence and the harsh realities of mortality, which defined how every individual experienced time, labor, and hope. In the 14th century, the Catholic Church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was the framework upon which much of European life rested. Its influence extended from the highest echelons of power to the furthest reaches of the peasant village, intertwining faith, law, and daily routine into a single all-encompassing system. For the common person, the Church's presence was inescapable, inscribed into the rhythms of life with the same certainty as the rising and setting of the sun. It dictated moral behavior, provided ritual and order, and exacted both devotion and resources with a weight that shaped every aspect of existence. The spiritual authority of the Church was expressed in both collective and personal life. Every individual was expected to participate in the sacraments. Baptism marked entry into the Christian community. Confirmation and communion reinforced faith and obedience, and confession and penance regulated moral behavior. The calendar of holy days was dense, dividing the year into periods of fasting, feasting, and observance. Sundays and saints' days were observed as sacred, though in practice, these obligations often conflicted with the necessities of labor, creating a tension between spiritual duty and survival. Clergy, from local parish priests to distant bishops, held both moral and judicial authority. They interpreted scripture and doctrine, deciding what constituted sin and prescribing penance for wrongdoing. Transgressions, even minor ones, could carry social consequences, creating a climate in which the individual's conscience was continuously monitored and regulated. Fear of divine punishment was reinforced by the teachings of hell and purgatory, and the promise of salvation became a powerful tool for social cohesion and control. The Church's authority was thus both internalized and externally enforced, shaping not only behavior but thought itself. In rural communities, the parish church served as the focal point of social life. It was the place where weddings, funerals, and baptisms occurred, but it was also the center of moral oversight. Clergy acted as intermediaries between the divine and the mundane, interpreting events, harvest failure, disease, death, as signs of spiritual favor or disfavor. Homilies emphasized obedience, humility, and acceptance of one's social position, reinforcing the rigid hierarchies that structured society. Even education, when available, was largely under ecclesiastical control, and literacy was often limited to those pursuing religious vocations. Monasteries and abbeys, too, extended the church's influence beyond immediate village life. These institutions owned vast tracts of land, controlled resources, and often acted as centers of economic as well as spiritual activity. Peasants might work on church lands, pay rent or labor dues, and participate in the ecclesiastical economy in ways that intertwined faith and survival. While monastic scribes preserved knowledge, but their work was largely for the benefit of the church itself, reinforcing doctrinal authority rather than personal empowerment. The church's control was also manifest in the administration of law and social order. Canon law regulated marriage, inheritance, and moral behavior, creating a parallel system that often intersected with secular governance. Disputes could be brought before ecclesiastical courts, where priests or bishops judged based on religious precepts, even in matters that might appear secular, such as property disputes or family disagreements. The church's interpretation of morality was decisive, embedding its authority in everyday life. The wealth of the church amplified its power. Income came from tithes, traditionally a tenth of a person's produce or earnings, as well as donations, indulgences, and the rents from vast estates. For peasants already burdened by labor, taxes, and scarcity, tithes represented a substantial claim on their limited resources. The act of giving was framed not merely as obligation but as spiritual necessity, intertwining faith and economic subordination. Even the poorest families understood that failure to meet ecclesiastical demands could jeopardize both social standing and spiritual well-being. Pilgrimages, relics, and saints' cults reinforced the church's omnipresence in personal life. Traveling to holy sites, venerating relics, and observing feast days were both acts of devotion and demonstrations of social conformity. The promise of protection from illness, misfortune, or spiritual damnation encouraged compliance, while the fear of divine wrath ensured that adherence was rarely optional. In effect, the church created a continuous invisible network of moral surveillance that extended from village to parish to diocese, linking the spiritual, social, and economic dimensions of life. The influence of the church also extended to education and knowledge. Most literacy in Europe was concentrated among clergy, and books were copied and preserved almost exclusively in monastic scriptoria. Learning outside this framework was rare, and the interpretation of scripture and doctrine was monopolized by those within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Scientific, medical, or philosophical inquiry was conducted within theological parameters, ensuring that the church's worldview remained central to both practical and intellectual life. Knowledge was a privilege, and access to it was mediated by religious authority. Even the simplest daily actions were framed in a spiritual context. Meals began with prayers of thanks, work was often punctuated with invocation or reflection, and illness or misfortune was interpreted as a test or punishment from God. Social rituals, from marriage customs to communal festivals, were infused with religious symbolism, and moral expectations were constantly reinforced through observation and ritualized participation. For the average villager, life was inseparable from the rhythms dictated by the church, which provided structure, certainty, and obligation in equal measure. This pervasive authority, however, was not merely spiritual. The church's political influence was profound, often exceeding that of secular rulers. Bishops and abbots controlled lands, levied taxes, and held judicial power, acting as intermediaries between peasants, nobility, and the crown. Decisions in local governance, allocation of resources, and dispute resolution were deeply entwined with ecclesiastical oversight. Obedience to the church was therefore both a moral and practical necessity. Compliance ensured not only spiritual favor but also protection within the social hierarchy. Through these mechanisms, the church shaped the very perception of time and the calendar. Religious festivals, fasts, and holy days divided the year into periods of work, reflection, and celebration. Seasonal labor was framed in relation to these observances, aligning agricultural activity with spiritual rhythms, Even when practical considerations demanded flexibility, the expectation of observance created a continuous cycle in which faith and labor were inseparable. In sum, the church in the 14th century was an institution whose reach penetrated every facet of life. Its authority was exercised through ritual, law, taxation, moral teaching, education, and political influence. It imposed order on an unpredictable world, but it did so with a weight that constrained personal freedom, dictated behavior, and demanded resources from those least able to spare them. It was a force of continuity, shaping the consciousness of individuals and the structure of communities in ways that made secular and spiritual life indistinguishable. And yet even this omnipresent authority rested upon material and economic realities, as peasants and townspeople were required to contribute their labor, produce and coin to sustain it. These demands would be formalized through tithes, levies and obligations, linking faith directly to the tangible burdens of survival, and creating a framework in which obedience to the church was inseparable from the exercise of daily labor, the management of resources, and the endurance of life itself. The next consideration, therefore, is the weight of authority measured not in sermons but in taxes, tithes and obligations imposed on a population already stretched by labor and scarcity. The world of the 14th century was structured in layers of authority, each demanding its due, and for the common peasant, life was defined by the ceaseless extraction of labor and resources by those above. The feudal system, while often idealized in later narratives, was for most a network of obligations that ensured survival at the mercy of landowners, lords and ecclesiastical authorities, leaving little room for autonomy or respite. Every day carried with it a subtle, sometimes overt, pressure, the knowledge that fields, produce and labor were not solely for the sustenance of one's own household, but were claimed by distant hierarchies that held power by tradition, law and coercion. At the heart of this system were rents and labor obligations. Peasants were bound to the land they worked, often through generations of tenure, and were expected to provide a portion of crops, livestock or labor to the lord of the manor. This could involve fixed rents, such as a percentage of wheat or barley, or more variable levies depending on yields and assessments. In addition, they were required to work directly on the lord's domain, the land reserved for the lord's own use. For set days of the week, ploughing, sowing, harvesting, or performing maintenance on buildings, roads and fences. Even when the household's own survival depended on work in the personal fields, obligations to the lord could not be ignored. Failure to comply could result in fines, corporal punishment or eviction. Tithes added an additional layer of extraction. While ostensibly religious in nature and directed to the church, tithes were often collected in kind, demanding a tenth of grain, eggs, or livestock. These levies intersected with secular obligations, creating a situation in which a family might surrender a substantial portion of its output to both lord and clergy. The tithing process was not uniform. Assessments could be arbitrary, collection rigorous, and enforcement harsh. Peasants navigated a delicate balance between meeting spiritual expectations and ensuring enough sustenance remained for daily life, a balance that was precarious at best. The arbitrary nature of some demands intensified the strain. Lords exercised considerable discretion in imposing additional levies for purposes that were sometimes practical, such as repairs to fortifications or roads, but often capricious, asserting power and reinforcing subordination. Fines for minor infractions, fees for market access, and contributions for local festivities or military levies were additional impositions. Even small deviations from expected behavior, whether perceived laziness, failure to attend mandatory work days or disputes over property, could result in additional burdens, deepening the peasant's vulnerability and sense of perpetual indebtedness. Agricultural yields were unpredictable, and yet obligations remained fixed. A poor harvest due to frost, drought or pest infestation did not reduce rents or tithes. Instead, the peasant household was forced to stretch already scarce resources, consuming reserves or borrowing from neighbors when possible. Debts often accumulated, creating a cycle of obligation that could span generations. Survival depended not only on labor, but on careful negotiation with both natural forces and human authority, and even the most diligent household could be overwhelmed by misfortune. The social and psychological dimensions of these obligations were profound. The knowledge that one's daily work contributed first to another's wealth instilled a sense of subordination that extended beyond economics. Life was measured not only by personal survival, but by the ability to fulfill duties imposed externally, leaving little room for personal planning or ambition. Social standing, reputation, and the avoidance of punishment depended upon the regularity and thoroughness of labor and payments, reinforcing a hierarchy that seemed both inevitable and unyielding. Corruption and exploitation further amplified the peasants' plight. Manorial stewards, bailiffs and tax collectors could inflate claims, seize goods, or apply coercion to extract more than what was customary. Such practices were rarely punished, as the legal and social systems prioritized the protection of lords' interests over those of subordinates. The risk of arbitrary violence or deprivation was a constant presence, a backdrop against which every field, hearth and transaction was conducted. The economic burden was compounded by social obligations that were both formal and informal. Festivities, religious observances, and village labor projects often required contributions of time, produce, or labor, layering additional costs upon an already stretched household. Even leisure or communal gatherings could entail hidden demands, ensuring that social participation was inseparable from economic subservience. The cycle of extraction was thus continuous, blending material, social, and moral obligations into a single, unrelenting rhythm of life. Households adapted in small ways, seeking to minimize loss and protect survival. Crops were stored carefully, small gardens maintained for personal consumption, and livestock managed for both sustenance and security. Families often engaged in informal exchange networks with neighbors, sharing resources to buffer against unpredictable shortfalls. Yet these measures could only partially offset the broader structures of obligation. The lord's rights were legally and socially enforced, and defiance was dangerous. Compliance, endurance, and careful calculation became daily imperatives, shaping both behavior and consciousness. In this environment, the experience of poverty was not merely the absence of wealth. It was a pervasive, structured condition. Life was defined by scarcity, imposed both by the natural world and by human hierarchies. Labor, production, and survival were inseparable from the demands of authority, and the margins for error were narrow. The psychological impact of this perpetual subjection reinforced a culture of resignation and endurance, where the expectation of hardship was internalized from childhood and accepted as a fundamental aspect of existence. The burden of lords and taxes also had long-term effects on communities. Wealth was concentrated at the top, opportunities for mobility were limited, and the vast majority of the population existed in a state of subsistence. Villages were structured to maximize extraction and minimize resistance, with communal norms, social pressure, and the threat of sanction ensuring conformity. Education, innovation, and leisure were rare, as the focus remained on fulfilling obligations and sustaining life under continuous external pressure. Even small improvements in personal or household circumstances were fragile, easily undone by poor weather, disease, or the sudden imposition of additional dues. Security, both economic and physical, was contingent upon compliance with multiple overlapping hierarchies, and the well-being of individuals was subordinated to the maintenance of social order and property rights. The peasant's world was thus shaped by both the visible and invisible weight of authority, a system in which survival required constant labor, vigilance, and adaptation. The cumulative effect of labor, scarcity, disease, and imposed obligations created a reality in which violence, whether overt or subtle, was never far from the surface. Land disputes, enforcement of manorial rights, and occasional conflicts between villages or factions introduced a further layer of uncertainty and risk, ensuring that life for ordinary people was not only exhausting but precarious, and setting the stage for understanding the pervasive presence of violence in the daily lives of the 14th century. Life in the 14th century was shaped not only by labor, scarcity, and disease, but also by the constant looming presence of law and its uneven application. Justice, as it existed, was slow, often arbitrary, and profoundly skewed in favor of those with wealth, status, or influence. For the peasant or artisan, the legal system was rarely a source of protection and more often an additional weight to bear, a constant reminder of vulnerability to the decisions of those above them. Courts were rarely impartial in the modern sense, and punishments when imposed were as much about social control as they were about rectifying wrongdoing. Petty crimes, from theft to disputes over property boundaries, were treated with severity designed to deter not only the individual offender, but the wider community. Offences that might today be resolved with a fine or mediation often incurred corporal punishment, public shaming, or forced labour. Stocks, pillories, flogging, mutilation and branding were common penalties for minor transgressions. The spectacle of punishment served as a form of social education, demonstrating the reach of authority and the consequences of defiance. Public executions were rare for ordinary offences, but were a vivid reminder of the state's ultimate power to remove life itself. Legal proceedings were slow, opaque, and expensive. Peasants often lacked the literacy, knowledge, or resources to present a case effectively, and outcomes depended heavily on the judgment of local lords, magistrates, or church officials. Witness testimony, when it mattered, was selective, favoring those of higher status. Legal codes existed, but their application was inconsistent, heavily influenced by social hierarchy and local custom. The very notion of fairness was contingent upon rank, wealth, and political connections. A poor man accused of theft faced severe punishment, while a wealthy landowner might evade consequence for similar behavior, simply by virtue of influence or wealth. Conflict between communities, families, or even within villages often escalated into violence before legal intervention could occur. Blood feuds, property disputes, and competition for scarce resources were addressed according to custom, honor, or force, rather than impartial justice. Arbitration was available in some regions, but it was mediated by local authorities, whose interests often aligned with the powerful, leaving the majority dependent on negotiation, endurance, or concealment. Social stability required compliance with these norms, but they imposed an almost continuous tension on daily life. The presence of officials, bailiffs, sheriffs, constables, was both reassuring and intimidating. These figures enforced manorial law, collected fines, and supervised the resolution of disputes. Their authority was broad, and the enforcement of penalties was immediate and often uncompromising. A farmer failing to deliver a portion of his harvest on time or a tradesman accused of minor theft could experience harsh consequences without opportunity for appeal. The weight of authority was immediate and personal, and survival required not only labor but constant awareness of regulations and expectations. The church's legal apparatus intersected with secular law, complicating matters further. Canon law regulated morality, marriage, and inheritance, providing a parallel system that could override local or feudal codes. Clergy acted as judges in ecclesiastical courts, and excommunication or penance could carry significant social and economic consequences. A villager accused of moral or religious transgression faced both spiritual and material penalties, reinforcing the inextricable link between faith, social order, and control. Even the threat of ecclesiastical censure created an environment of caution and conformity. Justice, or its absence, extended into daily life in subtler ways. Theft, disputes over grazing rights, or conflicts between neighbors were often handled informally, with violent resolution preferred when legal recourse seemed unreliable. Fear of reprisal, whether through law or social custom, dictated behavior. Children were taught from a young age the importance of obedience, caution, and negotiation, learning that deviation from established norms could result in injury, loss, or humiliation. Communities developed an acute awareness of risk, constantly balancing necessity with the potential for punishment. The slow, inequitable march of justice also reinforced broader hierarchies. Lords and landowners exercised judicial authority over their tenants, imposing fines and punishments that maintained dominance and discouraged dissent. Local customs codified submission, and over time both fear and habit internalized obedience as a social expectation. Resistance was rarely tolerated. Even minor defiance could provoke severe consequences, and communities were acutely aware of the risks associated with challenging authority. Punishments were often designed for maximum visibility and impact. Stocks and pillories placed offenders in the center of the village, subjecting them to humiliation, mockery, and sometimes physical assault from passers-by. Flogging or branding was administered publicly, ensuring that the lessons of transgression were absorbed communally. Even when not physically enforced, fines and property seizures had the same effect, signaling the omnipresence of authority and the limited autonomy of the peasant. Within households, awareness of law influenced internal behavior. Disputes among family members or within the village were often mediated with caution, as any altercation might be interpreted as a violation subject to sanction. Labor obligations, property management and economic planning were all conducted under the shadow of legal oversight. The slow rhythm of justice, delayed yet unyielding, shaped both actions and perceptions, embedding a sense of caution and endurance in daily life. This pervasive, uneven legal environment intersected with other pressures: labor, disease, scarcity, and religious authority. Life was not only physically demanding but socially constraining. The threat of punishment, combined with economic subjugation and vulnerability to illness, created a society in which survival required constant vigilance. Peasants and townspeople alike learned to navigate a complex system where rules existed but were inconsistently applied, where justice favored the powerful, and where endurance was itself a form of compliance. Even as individuals sought to protect themselves through work, negotiation, or avoidance, the structural inequities ensured that vulnerability was normalized. Life expectancy was short, and the risk of premature death from labor, disease, or punitive action was ever present. The legal system, rather than providing protection, reinforced social hierarchies and perpetuated dependence. In such a world, gendered experiences also defined vulnerability, as women in particular bore the compounded weight of social, economic, and legal subordination. The consequences of this inequitable justice system were manifold. Families could be deprived of labor or produce, communities were bound to conventions that favored elites, and individuals learned early that endurance, caution, and adaptation were essential strategies. Social cohesion was maintained, but at the cost of freedom, equality, and predictability. And yet, even these constraints intersected with the vulnerabilities associated with gender, which in the medieval world carried its own strictures, expectations, and perils. By the 14th century, life for those living in towns was a slow, relentless negotiation with the environment, dominated by overcrowding, filth, and the constant proximity of other humans and animals. Unlike the relatively open spaces of the countryside, where fields and pastures allowed some breathing room, urban life compressed every necessity, labor, and hazard into streets so narrow that sunlight barely touched the cobblestones. Towns were haphazardly constructed, often built over centuries without regulation, with timber-framed houses leaning precariously over each other, upper floors jutting into the street, creating darkened corridors where air stagnated and odors lingered. The streets themselves were a mixture of mud, waste, and refuse. Animals roamed freely. Pigs, goats, and dogs scavenged for scraps, leaving dung that mixed with water from wells, rain, or household cleaning, to create an ever-present layer of sludge. Human waste, seldom managed in any systematic way, was deposited directly into streets, rivers, or open cesspits. Even in relatively wealthy towns, the combination of urine, excrement, rotting food, and refuse created an acrid, pungent atmosphere that could linger for weeks, especially during warmer months when decay accelerated. The smell was constant and unavoidable, saturating clothing, hair, and skin, and forming an invisible, inescapable layer over every activity. Noise added another dimension of discomfort. Towns were alive with the sounds of human labor, children crying, animals braying, and tradespeople calling out wares. Hammers, saws, and grinding stones punctuated daily work, while the sounds of carts and wagons navigating uneven cobblestones added a rhythm, both jarring and unending. Even the bells of churches, marking the hours or calling worshippers to prayer, contributed to a soundscape that left little room for silence or reprieve. Residents grew accustomed to this continuous hum, but it was a backdrop that added stress and shaped routines. Houses themselves were dark and cramped, Most structures had a single main room with a hearth for cooking and heating, a loft or upper chamber for sleeping, and little in the way of ventilation. Smoke from open fires filled the air, mingling with the odors of cooking, refuse, and human habitation. Floors were often dirt or simple planks, and drainage was minimal. In such conditions, diseases, lice, and other parasites flourished, creating a constant low-grade assault on health. The very act of moving through the town required negotiation with these environmental hazards, from dodging animal waste to stepping carefully over uneven streets, all while carrying out the necessary routines of work, trade, or social interaction. Water management in towns was a particular challenge. Wells, cisterns, and rivers were shared among large numbers of people, and contamination was common. The same water might be used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and animal husbandry, ensuring that pathogens spread quickly. Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like symptoms, and other waterborne diseases were common, especially in warmer months or during floods. Hygiene, even when attempted, was limited by infrastructure. Few towns had paved streets, formal sewage, or effective waste removal. Residents adapted through caution, selective use of water, or reliance on herbal remedies, but exposure remained unavoidable. Social interactions were intense and unavoidable. Crowding meant that families, neighbors, and strangers were constantly in close contact, creating opportunities for both cooperation and conflict. Arguments over space, goods, or rights of way were frequent, and minor disputes could escalate due to the physical closeness and heightened stress of urban living. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Every action, conversation, and activity was performed in view or earshot of others, reinforcing social norms while amplifying pressure and tension. The economic structure of towns added yet another layer of challenge. Trades, markets, and workshops were often built into the same spaces used for living, blending labor and domesticity in ways that intensified exposure to risk and discomfort. Smoke from forges, smells from tanneries, and dust from mills and workshops compounded the already oppressive environment. Noise and hazards were omnipresent, and occupational risks added to the daily strain, from burns to cuts to chronic respiratory irritation. Work and survival were inseparable, and the boundaries between home, street, and workplace were blurred. Storage of goods was precarious. Food, textiles, and materials were kept in cramped spaces, often poorly ventilated and vulnerable to pests. Rodents were ubiquitous, feeding on scraps and destroying provisions, spreading disease, and challenging human habitation. Preservation methods were rudimentary, relying on salting, drying, or smoking when possible, but spoilage remained a constant threat. Households had to balance the need to store necessities against the limitations of space and the risk of contamination, a daily calculation with significant consequences. Security was another concern. The density of population, combined with limited policing, made theft, robbery, and occasional violence an ever-present risk. Streets, alleyways, and market areas offered opportunity for petty criminals, while powerful guilds or landowners could enforce protection and claims selectively. Ordinary residents learned to navigate these risks through vigilance, cooperation with neighbors, and sometimes avoidance, but the threat of loss or injury was inescapable. Even sensory perception was under strain. The combination of smells, sounds, and visual disorder created a constant cognitive load. Residents adapted gradually, but the cumulative effect was fatigue, stress, and a muted sense of comfort. Sleep was affected by noise, temperature, and the proximity of neighbors or animals, compounding the physical exhaustion of labor with the psychological impact of living in such dense and demanding conditions. Children experienced this environment from birth. They were exposed to the same hazards as adults: filth, disease, noise, and overcrowding. While learning the rules and rhythms of urban survival, play and exploration were constrained by the physical dangers of streets and alleys, and lessons about obedience, caution, and endurance were absorbed in the same sensory environment that shaped adult life. The vulnerability of youth was heightened by exposure, limited nutrition, and the absence of formal protection or health care. Thus, the narrow streets of medieval towns were microcosms of hardship, where the human body and mind were in constant negotiation with environment, labor, and social obligation. Life was defined by proximity to people, animals, waste, and danger, creating a daily reality that required resilience, adaptation, and endurance. The town was alive in every sense, physically, socially, and chemically, yet its vitality was inseparable from discomfort and hazard, blending survival, labor, and exposure into a seamless, relentless experience. This dense, demanding urban environment intersected naturally with the economic pressures of trade and markets. The necessity of buying, selling, producing, and exchanging goods intensified the work of survival, linking personal endurance to community networks and the rhythms of commerce. Economic imperatives in such confined spaces dictated patterns of labor, consumption, and risk, forming the context for understanding how markets and trade shaped the medieval town and setting the stage for the next exploration. The burdens and pressures of economic life in 14th century Europe, even in the dense, narrow streets of medieval towns, far from the open fields of the countryside, the shadow of conflict was never absent. The 14th century was marked by continual low-level turbulence, a persistent hum of violence and unrest that extended from minor local feuds to the broader, devastating wars that swept across Europe and beyond. For ordinary people, these conflicts were rarely distant abstractions. They were physical, economic, and psychological realities that shaped daily existence, dictated movement, and imposed risks that could destroy households and livelihoods overnight. At the local level, disputes between families, villages, or guilds often escalated into armed confrontations. Land boundaries were contested. Claims to water, pasture, or resources ignited arguments that could spiral into violence. Even seemingly minor disagreements could require defense or intervention, drawing peasants, artisans, and townspeople into skirmishes they neither desired nor fully understood. The law, when it intervened at all, often favored those with wealth, status, or connections, leaving ordinary participants to navigate both danger and uncertainty largely on their own. Survival in such circumstances demanded vigilance, strategic alliances, and sometimes submission to the stronger party. Beyond these local disputes, the specter of organized warfare was ever present. Lords and kings waged campaigns to defend or expand territories, asserting authority through taxation, conscription, and the mobilization of peasant labor. Soldiers might pass through villages, requisitioning food, livestock, or shelter, leaving households depleted and vulnerable. Even towns removed from the immediate front lines faced economic disruption as trade routes became unsafe, markets destabilized, and goods became scarce or prohibitively expensive. The arrival of armed bands, whether sanctioned or rogue, could result in theft, injury, or death, reminding inhabitants that conflict was never confined to the battlefield. The psychological burden of war extended beyond physical destruction. The unpredictability of raids, the rumor of advancing armies, and the visible movement of troops created an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. Communities were forced to develop coping strategies, securing valuables, storing food, maintaining livestock under guard, and coordinating defense when possible. Children absorbed the ambient fear, learning early that life was fragile and contingent, that safety could never be assumed, and that survival often depended on prudence, endurance, and a willingness to acquiesce to circumstances beyond control. Economic impacts of conflict compounded these stresses. Armies needed sustenance, and requisitioning was often enforced without compensation. Fields might be trampled, livestock seized, and trade disrupted, leaving peasants, artisans, and merchants struggling to maintain subsistence. Markets could collapse or experience price spikes as goods became scarce, further amplifying insecurity. Even those far from immediate combat were affected through indirect channels. Delayed harvests, disrupted trade, or the loss of distant kin conscripted into service. The ordinary person's daily life was inseparable from the cycles of preparation, deprivation, and repair that war imposed. Large-scale wars, such as the ongoing 100 Years' War between England and France, created persistent instability across regions. Entire generations of men could be drawn into military service, leaving families without labor to manage fields or produce essential goods. Women and children were forced to assume tasks previously carried out by men, increasing the physical and emotional burden on households already stretched thin. The social fabric was disrupted, and traditional hierarchies were stressed as necessity forced improvisation and adaptation. These pressures magnified the precariousness of survival, and reinforced the sense that human life was fragile and subject to forces beyond individual control. Even beyond direct military engagement, conflict influenced governance and taxation. Rulers imposed levies and requisitions to fund campaigns, and local lords demanded contributions in labor or produce. Ordinary people bore the weight of sustaining both armies and households simultaneously, often without relief. Non-compliance, whether due to inability or resistance, could provoke punitive measures, further compounding hardship. This interconnection of warfare and economic obligation ensured that the effects of conflict were deeply embedded in everyday life, extending beyond the battlefield and into kitchens, workshops, and fields. The threat of banditry and marauding soldiers added another layer of vulnerability. Traveling between towns, villages, or markets carried inherent risks. Roads were insecure, isolated dwellings could be raided, and travelers could be ambushed. Precautionary measures were limited, guards were expensive, knowledge of safe routes was imperfect, and the timing of raids was unpredictable. Consequently, even necessary activities, fetching water, bringing goods to market, or visiting relatives, involved careful planning and constant awareness of potential danger. Fear became an ingrained aspect of movement, shaping routines and constraining choices. Communities developed informal mechanisms to mitigate these risks. Villagers might band together to provide collective protection, erecting rudimentary defenses, maintaining watch systems, or negotiating agreements with local lords or soldiers. Towns, too, created guilds, militias, or watch rotations to manage security. Yet these efforts were imperfect, contingent, and often inadequate, reflecting the imbalance between resources and threats. Ordinary people had to live with the persistent awareness that any day might bring disruption, loss, or violence. War also intersected with disease and famine, compounding vulnerabilities. Armies could carry plague, worsen sanitation, or deplete local resources. Fields abandoned due to conscription or raids might fail to produce sufficient food, leaving communities exposed to scarcity. These interconnected pressures, conflict, hunger, and illness, created a multi-layered environment in which survival demanded constant adjustment, endurance, and adaptation. Life became a series of negotiations with forces both human and natural, each amplifying the impact of the other. The cumulative effect of these conflicts on the human psyche was profound. Generations grew accustomed to instability, learning that planning was provisional and security tenuous. Individuals internalized the expectation of suffering, developing resilience but also a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Social cohesion was maintained through shared experience, local authority, and the mutual recognition of risk, but it was a fragile cohesion, susceptible to disruption whenever external forces intruded. Thus, the 14th century world, already burdened by labor, disease, and social hierarchy, was further shaped by the persistent presence of conflict. Violence was not always immediate or catastrophic, but it was constant, infiltrating every aspect of life from the countryside to the densest towns. Even in moments of apparent calm, the memory of raids, the rumor of advancing armies, and the structural pressures imposed by war were never absent. Ordinary people navigated a landscape defined by preparation, endurance, and the acceptance of circumstances beyond their control, setting the stage for one of the most immediate and terrifying forces of medieval existence, the threat of famine and the failure of harvests. In the 14th century, the lives of women were shaped by a relentless combination of expectation, obligation, and vulnerability, a condition intensified by social, economic, and religious structures that left little room for autonomy. Women's existence was largely defined by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, and mothers, and their value was often measured by their capacity to serve family, secure alliances through marriage, and maintain households under conditions that were physically and socially demanding. From birth, girls were raised with an awareness that their lives would be circumscribed by duty, obedience, and labor, preparing them for a world in which personal choice was severely limited, and survival often depended upon endurance and compliance. Marriage, while ostensibly a personal milestone, was frequently a transaction negotiated by families to consolidate land, wealth, or social standing. Women had little say in the selection of their spouses, and the alignment of families' interests took precedence over individual desire. Dowries, gifts of property, or obligations from the bride's family were common, binding households together through economic and social contracts. The bride entered a union in which her labor, fertility, and obedience were assumed and demanded, and failure to fulfill these expectations could result in social censure or personal hardship. Personal affection or compatibility was secondary to duty, and the consequences of mismatch were borne largely by the woman, whose status and security depended upon her ability to conform. Domestic labor consumed women's lives from the moment of marriage. They were responsible for managing households, tending gardens, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool or flax, brewing ale, and caring for children, elderly relatives, and often sick household members. In peasant households, these duties were relentless and physically demanding, compounded by agricultural labor in the fields during planting or harvest seasons. The separation between domestic and economic work was minimal, and the boundaries between home and labor, personal time and survival, were all but non-existent. Women carried the weight of sustaining life in environments defined by scarcity, disease, and social expectation. Childbearing was both a responsibility and a hazard. Women were expected to produce children consistently, ensuring the continuation of family lines and labor supply. Pregnancy, however, carried immense risk, with maternal mortality rates high due to complications such as infection, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor. The absence of effective medical care, understanding of hygiene, or emergency intervention made childbirth a constant gamble, a repetition of labor that could end in tragedy for mother, child, or both. Those who survived repeated pregnancies bore cumulative physical damage, their health eroded by the demands of reproduction and work, leaving them physically weakened even as they continued to fulfill household and social obligations. Women's legal and social rights were severely constrained. In most regions, property ownership, inheritance, and contractual authority were limited, ensuring that men retained control over land and resources. Or widows and unmarried women could experience some degree of autonomy, but their status was fragile and contingent upon social perception, wealth, and family support. Accusations of impropriety, adultery, or failure to perform expected duties could result in punishment, social ostracism, or loss of security. Even religious obligations, while often framed as moral guidance, reinforced women's subordination, emphasizing piety, obedience, and domestic diligence as markers of virtue. The physical toll of women's labor was compounded by environmental conditions. Smoke-filled homes, crowded living spaces, and insufficient nutrition made daily life exhausting. Exposure to disease was constant, whether from caring for the sick, working in contaminated spaces, or interacting with children and animals in unsanitary environments. These factors intersected with social expectation. Women were to maintain appearances, manage households efficiently, and produce heirs, all while navigating a landscape in which failure, illness, or misfortune could have profound consequences. Women also bore the brunt of social instability caused by war, famine, or disease. Men conscripted into military service, or killed in conflict, left households dependent on women for both labor and survival. During food shortages, women were tasked with rationing supplies, preserving provisions, and managing household economies under extreme duress. The pressure of sustaining life in times of scarcity fell disproportionately on their shoulders, a reflection of broader social structures that relied upon female labor, both domestically and economically, without acknowledging the immense human cost. Childbearing and domestic management were closely linked to social surveillance. Women's behavior, sexuality, and fertility were monitored by families, communities, and religious institutions. Honor and virtue were socially enforced. Deviation from prescribed roles could result in censure, punishment, or exploitation. The constant need to adhere to expectations created psychological stress, compounded by the ever-present physical demands of labor and reproduction. In many ways, women's survival required not only physical strength, but a continuous negotiation with social norms, male authority, and environmental hazards. Education, when available, was minimal and focused largely on domestic skills, religious instruction, or moral training. Literacy and broader intellectual engagement were rare, except for women in specific religious orders or wealthy households, and even then, opportunities were limited. Knowledge was practical, shaped by immediate survival and household management, rather than personal development or social mobility. This lack of educational access reinforced dependency, ensuring that women's influence remained circumscribed by the parameters set by family, husband, or religious authority. Despite these constraints, women developed strategies of endurance and adaptation. Knowledge of herbal remedies, food preservation, midwifery, and household management became essential tools for survival. Informal networks of kin and neighbors provided support in times of crisis, facilitating the exchange of labor, resources, and information. These networks were crucial for mitigating the hardships imposed by social structure, environmental conditions, and human authority, though they were never sufficient to eliminate risk or suffering entirely. Women's experiences also varied depending on social class, geography, and local customs. Noble or wealthy women faced different pressures, managing estates, supervising laborers, or navigating political alliances, but even their lives were constrained by patriarchal structures and expectations of fertility, obedience, and propriety. Peasant women, urban wives, and widows each navigated unique challenges, yet all shared the commonality of limited autonomy, continuous labor, and exposure to both physical and social hazards. In this environment, the lives of women were inseparable from the broader hardships of the 14th century. Labor, disease, scarcity, legal inequity, and social expectation intertwined to create a reality in which endurance was essential. Their experiences highlight the gendered dimensions of medieval life, emphasizing that the burdens of survival, compliance, and vulnerability were not evenly distributed. Understanding women's condition in this era provides a fuller picture of the relentless pressures faced by ordinary people and the ways in which societal structures magnified human suffering. The cumulative impact of gendered labor, legal constraint, and reproductive expectation inevitably shaped family structures and childhood. Children were born into households already struggling with labor, scarcity, and danger. From the moment of birth, their existence was inseparable from survival imperatives. They entered a world in which work, obedience, and vulnerability defined early life, and where learning the skills and strategies necessary for endurance began almost immediately, setting the stage for the next aspect of medieval experience, the weight of childhood, and the demands placed upon the youngest members of society. In the 14th century, childhood, as a distinct protected stage of life, was largely absent, particularly for the majority of the population bound to labor, subsistence, and survival. From the moment of birth, children were exposed to the precarious conditions that defined medieval existence: crowded, unsanitary dwellings, insufficient nutrition, and the constant risk of disease. Infant mortality rates were high, and families understood, often painfully, that many children would not survive to adulthood. This pervasive fragility shaped parenting, social behavior, and the allocation of labor within households, creating an environment in which the survival of both individual children and the family unit depended upon immediate integration into the rhythms of work and responsibility. Infants were vulnerable to numerous hazards. Birth itself was risky, and without skilled medical care, many mothers and newborns perished during delivery. In early months, exposure to contaminated water, poor hygiene, and disease was often fatal. The prevalence of parasites, respiratory infections, and malnutrition meant that even robust children could succumb to conditions that modern medicine would easily treat. Those who survived the earliest months entered a world in which protection was limited, and care often consisted of ensuring minimal exposure to immediate threats, while gradually introducing them to the household's labor needs. As soon as they were able to walk or manipulate tools, children became participants in the household economy. In peasant families, toddlers were taught to tend animals, carry water, assist in planting or harvesting, and manage small domestic tasks. The learning process was intertwined with necessity. Work was not merely educational but essential for household survival. Older children assumed greater responsibilities, spinning wool, baking bread, or managing younger siblings, integrating labor and family care into a routine that began almost immediately upon achieving mobility. Play, when it existed, was functional, often imitating adult activities, or serving as preparation for future responsibilities, rather than purely recreational. Childhood in urban environments carried its own challenges. In towns, children were involved in trades from an early age, apprenticing within households, workshops or family businesses. Boys might learn the basics of carpentry, smithing, or commerce, while girls were trained in domestic crafts, weaving, brewing, or sewing. Apprenticeship began at a young age, sometimes before 10, and required adherence to discipline, long hours, and the subordination of personal desire to the demands of masters, parents, and guild structures. Education was incidental and practical, focused on the skills necessary to sustain life and earn a livelihood, rather than intellectual or creative development. Illness, injury, and vulnerability were constants. Children's small bodies were exposed to hazards ranging from fire and sharp tools, to the environmental hazards of overcrowded streets, animals, and contaminated water. Disease could strike suddenly, and even minor wounds could become fatal in the absence of effective treatment. The mortality rate shaped social attitudes. Parents were often prepared for the loss of children, a grim understanding that framed care, expectation, and emotional investment in ways that were foreign to modern sensibilities. Nutrition and sustenance were limited and unevenly distributed. In households struggling with famine, disease, or scarcity, children often received the smallest portion of food, with priority given to adult laborers or those deemed capable of contributing immediately to survival. Malnutrition was common, weakening immune systems and predisposing young people to disease. Growth, physical development, and cognitive function were all constrained by the limitations of diet, environment, and labor demands, leaving children both physically and socially subordinated within their families and communities. Beyond labor and survival, children were socialized into the hierarchies and norms of medieval society from an early age. They observed and internalized gender roles, labor expectations, and social conduct, learning that obedience, endurance, and conformity were necessary for survival. Knowledge was transmitted orally, through observation, and through imitation, creating a culture in which children absorbed lessons in resilience, caution, and the rhythms of work before ever fully understanding the broader social structures that shaped their existence. Education was rare and highly contingent. In towns, some children of wealthier families might receive instruction in reading, arithmetic, or religious doctrine, often limited to boys. In rural households, literacy was uncommon, and knowledge was primarily practical, understanding seasonal rhythms, domestic tasks, and the rudimentary arithmetic needed for trade or tax obligations. The absence of formal education reinforced dependency, ensuring that children learned to survive rather than to question or innovate. Childhood labor also served a social function, binding children to households, extended kin networks, and the wider economic system. By participating in productive work, children contributed to family survival, reinforced social expectations, and gained early exposure to the structures of obligation and authority that dominated their communities. Failure to participate or inadequacy in labor could result in punishment or social disapproval, further embedding the notion that survival required discipline, endurance, and conformity. The experience of childhood in this era was thus one of continuous adaptation to hardship. Physical labor, exposure to disease, and limited nutrition combined with socialization into strict hierarchies to create a formative environment that demanded resilience. Play, education, and leisure were minimal, and personal freedom was largely absent. Children existed primarily as contributors to survival, preparing from the earliest age for the relentless demands of adult life, in which labor, obedience, and vulnerability would continue to define experience. Even in moments of rest, children were subject to the stresses imposed by their environment: crowded living quarters, the omnipresence of disease, noise, and limited comfort. Sleep itself was often interrupted or shared with siblings and adults, a continuation of the pervasive physical and social demands that shaped every hour of life. In this way, childhood, far from being a time of innocence, was a preparation for the ceaseless endurance required in adulthood, instilling patterns of work, resilience, and cautious behavior that would persist for the rest of their lives. The weight of childhood naturally led into the structure of adult labor and craft, particularly as the transition from dependent child to apprentice or worker involved learning the slow, repetitive, and demanding routines of craft, trade, and production. This next stage of life, characterized by long hours, minimal reward, and continuous engagement with environmental and social pressures, demonstrates how the rhythms of medieval existence were transmitted across generations, linking early endurance to adult responsibility, and shaping the economic and social framework that governed the 14th century. By the 14th century, the exercise of authority and the maintenance of order in medieval society were inseparable from the demonstration of force. Punishment, especially when intended as a deterrent, was deliberately brutal, public, and inescapable. The mechanisms of control, stocks, whipping posts, public executions, branding and mutilation, served both a punitive and pedagogical function. They were designed to instill obedience, communicate the consequences of disobedience, and reinforce the hierarchical structure that kept lords, magistrates, and clergy in positions of power while ordinary people remained subordinated. For the average person, the sight, smell, and knowledge of such punishments were constant reminders that survival was not only contingent upon labor, adaptation, and skill, but also upon careful navigation of a social order that could be violently enforced at any moment. The spectacle of punishment was carefully staged. Town squares, village greens, and crossroads were chosen for visibility. Stocks confined the offender's limbs, exposing them to humiliation, ridicule, and sometimes physical attack from passers-by. Whipping posts inflicted pain with repetitive, often brutal strikes, while branding marked individuals permanently, ensuring that both physical and social consequences endured. Public executions, whether by hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake, were rare in absolute numbers, but devastating in psychological impact. The event was both a ritual and a warning. The community witnessed the literal and symbolic removal of a transgressor, reinforcing norms, and demonstrating that authority was immediate and unyielding. The application of punishment was inherently unequal. Wealth, status, and social connections could mitigate consequences or entirely exempt an offender from the harshest penalties. The poor, by contrast, were particularly vulnerable. Even minor infractions could result in severe physical suffering or permanent disability. Theft, neglect of feudal duties, and disputes over property boundaries could lead to penalties that were disproportionate to the act itself, reflecting the systemic bias embedded in legal and social structures. The threat of punishment extended beyond the individual. Entire families or communities could be implicated if one member failed to comply, reinforcing collective responsibility and social pressure to conform. Beyond physical suffering, punishment carried psychological and social consequences. Exposure in public, humiliation, and the awareness of vulnerability created a pervasive climate of fear. Children, growing up in this environment, internalized lessons about authority, hierarchy, and personal limitation from an early age. Observing the consequences of minor transgressions instilled a cautious temperament and reinforced adherence to social norms. Adults, too, navigated life under constant awareness that minor missteps, whether in labor, trade, or personal conduct, could escalate into severe and public consequence. Compliance was reinforced not through choice, but through survival instincts, learned over years of exposure to the ever-present threat of coercion. The instruments of punishment were closely intertwined with the exercise of labor and economic obligation. Failure to deliver tithes, rents, or produce, neglect of assigned work, or inability to meet feudal or municipal demands could result in physical penalties. Laborers were often punished for inefficiency, tardiness, or perceived insubordination, emphasizing that obedience and productivity were inseparable in the eyes of authority. Even the smallest misstep could invite the attention of officials, magistrates, or lords, who enforced their will with precision and unflinching severity. Punishments were also a communal experience, blending spectacle with social reinforcement. Crowds gathered to observe whippings, executions, or humiliations, and participation in the observation reinforced social hierarchies. Villagers and townspeople absorbed moral lessons, internalized caution, and discussed the transgressions and consequences as a means of collective education. Public punishment was a medium through which power was communicated. fear cultivated, and order maintained, a constant immersive reminder of the precariousness of ordinary life. The church played a role in the broader system of control, often cooperating with secular authorities or imposing its own sanctions. Excommunication, penance, and ecclesiastical fines could compound physical punishments, creating a dual system in which spiritual and temporal authority reinforced one another. The threat of eternal consequence, paired with immediate corporal penalty, intensified the psychological pressure exerted on individuals, ensuring that social and religious norms were internalized through both fear and habituation. Punishment also reflected the values and anxieties of the time. Crimes perceived as morally or socially disruptive were treated with particular severity. Theft, rebellion, sexual transgression, and challenges to authority were not only violations of law but affronts to the social order itself. As a result, the penalties were designed to be memorable, to leave a mark, physical, psychological, and communal, that would prevent repetition and communicate the stakes to the wider populace. The medieval system of justice was less concerned with rehabilitation than with deterrence, control, and the affirmation of hierarchy. Even mundane acts of control were imbued with physical rigor. Manorial courts, guild oversight, and village authorities maintained compliance through fines, coercion, and public censure. Laborers were disciplined for failing to meet quotas or deadlines, apprentices for disobedience, and tenants for neglecting obligations. The rhythm of everyday life was punctuated by these reminders. Authority was both constant and unyielding, a framework in which survival required attentiveness, submission, and acceptance of the social order. The psychological burden of this system was profound. Life was lived with the understanding that punishment could arrive suddenly, that visibility did not confer protection, and that authority was absolute. Ordinary people became skilled at anticipating the expectations of lords, magistrates, and church officials, negotiating daily existence to minimize risk and avoid exposure. Even acts of leisure or creativity were moderated by the pervasive awareness of consequences. Fear was a constant companion, shaping decisions, behavior, and social relations in ways both subtle and explicit. The brutality of control did not eliminate human ingenuity or social resilience. Communities developed informal methods to mitigate risk, from negotiated agreements to discreet aid and protective alliances. Yet these strategies were always provisional, fragile, and dependent on social, economic, and political contingencies. The inevitability of punishment remained a defining aspect of life, shaping rhythms, expectations, and the psychological landscape of medieval society. The omnipresence of public punishment, corporal coercion, and social surveillance naturally intertwined with the moral and spiritual pressures exerted by religion. Daily routines, labor, diet, and social interaction were all structured by religious expectation, reinforcing hierarchy and obedience. The fear of divine retribution, coupled with the immediacy of secular punishment, created a society in which moral, legal, and social compliance were deeply intertwined. The interplay between physical coercion and spiritual discipline ensured that individuals were subjected to multiple, overlapping layers of control, preparing them for the next dimension of medieval life. The unrelenting weight of religion on daily existence. For those living in towns and villages, the pursuit of craft and trade defined daily existence in a manner that was both physically exhausting and psychologically unrelenting. Artisans and apprentices, the backbone of medieval economies, labored under conditions that demanded technical skill, endurance, and unceasing diligence, yet offered minimal comfort or security. From the first light of dawn until the dimming of day, every action was measured against the standards of the guild, the expectations of customers, and the economic pressures of survival. Life for these individuals was a continuous negotiation with material scarcity, social obligation, and physical limitation, where the pursuit of mastery in a craft was inseparable from the burdens of daily life. Apprenticeships began early, often in childhood or early adolescence, and were structured to instill both skill and obedience. A young apprentice, sometimes only 7 or 8 years old, was placed under the authority of a master craftsman, learning the intricacies of a trade through repetitive labor, observation, and instruction. Tasks ranged from the simplest menial chores, cleaning workshops, preparing materials, tending fires, to progressively more skilled work as the apprentice demonstrated competence and endurance. The apprenticeship system was exacting, long hours, limited personal freedom, and harsh discipline were standard, reflecting both the necessity of labor and the socialization of obedience. Masters, who controlled workshops, dictated not only the techniques of production, but also the rhythm and intensity of labor. The quality of work was constantly monitored, as substandard performance could result in economic loss, censure, or even physical punishment. Guild regulations codified standards for materials, dimensions and procedures, and failure to comply could have serious consequences for both the workshop and the individual. In this way, the labor of apprenticeship was inseparable from social and economic pressures. Technical skill, compliance with authority, and the endurance of exhaustion were intertwined in the daily experience of trade. Hours were long and unrelenting. Craftsmen worked from sunrise to sunset, often extending into twilight during busy seasons or in preparation for market days and fairs. The physical toll was considerable. Repetitive motion, exposure to heat, sharp tools, and hazardous materials created chronic fatigue, injury, and over time, permanent disability. For apprentices and journeymen alike, the body was constantly engaged, rarely at rest, and always subject to the dual demands of economic productivity and guild conformity. Comfort was minimal, breaks were short, and conditions often reflected the utilitarian priority of output over health. Economic pressures compounded the intensity of labor. Artisans were dependent upon the fluctuating demands of customers, market availability, and guild regulations. Materials could be scarce or expensive, adding both financial strain and the necessity of careful management. Seasonal variations dictated work cycles, with peak demand before holidays, fairs, or religious festivals, creating periods of particularly grueling labor. The success of a workshop, and by extension the livelihood of its apprentices, was contingent upon sustained effort, technical precision, and the unpredictable favor of the marketplace. Guilds, while offering some protections, also imposed strict standards and obligations. Membership was often costly, with fees, dues, and mandatory contributions for social and religious events. Guilds controlled training, restricted competition, and regulated trade practices, ensuring that quality and price were maintained but limiting personal freedom and mobility. Apprentices and journeymen were tightly bound by these systems, and failure to adhere to guild norms could result in expulsion, loss of work, or social marginalization. Life in craft and trade was thus a constant negotiation between individual labor, communal expectation, and economic necessity. The social structure of workshops reinforced hierarchies and dependence. Masters held authority over apprentices and journeymen, determining not only the content of work, but also living arrangements, discipline, and access to advancement. Apprentices might live in the household of the master, further intertwining domestic labor with professional training. Personal autonomy was limited, and negotiation of rights, tasks, or time was constrained by the demands of authority, economic imperatives, and guild regulations. Independence was achieved only gradually, and even then, success required both skill and the ability to navigate complex social relationships. Health hazards were pervasive. Workshops exposed workers to dust, smoke, lead, dye chemicals, or open flames, depending on the trade. Repetitive motion, long periods of standing, and inadequate nutrition contributed to chronic fatigue, musculoskeletal strain, and long-term physical impairment. Injuries could easily curtail employment or reduce productivity, making the maintenance of physical well-being both essential and difficult. Illness, even when minor, carried economic consequences, and the social safety nets for craftsmen were limited, relying largely on guild solidarity or family support. The psychological dimension of work was equally demanding. Apprentices and artisans faced constant evaluation, social pressure, and the stress of economic dependency. Mistakes could have immediate consequences, from financial loss to public reprimand, while mastery was measured against both communal standards and market expectations. The sense of constant scrutiny, and the knowledge that skill, diligence, and endurance determined survival, created a climate in which work was inseparable from identity and daily consciousness. Even leisure and socialization were structured around trade. Guilds organized festivals, religious observances, and communal events, linking work, social cohesion, and spiritual duty. These occasions were rare respites, but also reaffirmed obligations and hierarchies, reminding participants that personal freedom was circumscribed by social and economic networks. Life in craft and trade was thus a continuum. Labor, social integration, and moral expectation formed a seamless structure that dominated every aspect of experience. Artisans and apprentices were integral to the functioning of medieval towns and economies, yet their labor was undervalued in terms of comfort, security, and personal freedom. Success required skill, endurance, and adaptability, but even mastery did not eliminate exposure to risk, economic fluctuation, or the demands of social authority. Each day was a cycle of repetitive labor, observation, and correction, a rhythm in which personal desire was subordinated to necessity, authority, and survival. This relentless engagement with labor, authority, and survival was closely linked to the pervasive weight of religion on daily life. Work was framed not only by economic and social structures, but also by spiritual expectation. Religious observance, ritual participation, and moral compliance intersected with labor, punishment, and social hierarchy, ensuring that every action, from apprenticeship tasks to market dealings, was embedded in a broader moral and cosmic framework. The continuity between work and spiritual life reinforced endurance, obedience, and vigilance, preparing individuals for the next dimension of medieval experience, the unyielding influence of religion on daily existence. In the 14th century, the passage of time was defined as much by the cycles of scarcity as by the progression of days, weeks, and months. And among these cycles, the periods known as the lean months stood as relentless markers of endurance, periods in which the already fragile balance of subsistence was tested to its limits. Life for the majority of the population, bound to the rhythms of agriculture and the vicissitudes of weather, was governed by these intervals when stored food dwindled, markets offered little, and every meal was contingent upon the success of the previous season. For peasants, laborers, and the urban poor alike, these months were a constant negotiation with hunger, fatigue, and the ever-present spectre of starvation. Harvests, while celebrated, were rarely sufficient to ensure year-round abundance. Even in favorable conditions, stored grain, dried vegetables, and salted meat provided only a partial buffer against scarcity. The months preceding the new harvest were particularly perilous. Winter had depleted stored supplies, spring planting demanded labor, and the quality of what remained from the previous year often deteriorated. In many regions this period extended for several months, with families relying upon increasingly meager rations and improvisation to survive. Bread, the staple of sustenance, became thinner, coarser, and less frequent. Pottages were stretched, and any supplementary food, such as nuts, wild roots, or occasionally foraged greens, was precious. The physical effects of prolonged hunger were profound. Adults and children alike experienced fatigue, weakness, and susceptibility to disease. Labor in the fields, workshops, or households became increasingly arduous, and productivity declined precisely when labor was most necessary for planting, tending livestock, or preparing for market. Malnutrition compromised the body's resilience, exacerbating the toll of disease, injury, and the physical exertion of daily work. The visible signs of hunger, emaciation, pallor, and lethargy were constant reminders of the delicate line separating subsistence from calamity. Economic pressures compounded the scarcity. Grain, meat, and other essential goods were subject to price fluctuations, hoarding, and the demands of lords, merchants, and local authorities. Even when food was theoretically available, it might be inaccessible to those lacking coin or influence. Markets became arenas of negotiation and desperation, and households expended considerable effort simply to secure minimal provisions. The lean months were therefore as much a psychological burden as a material one. The knowledge that scarcity was imminent or ongoing shaped daily decisions, labor allocation, and the planning of household consumption. Communities adapted through both formal and informal strategies. Preservation techniques, such as drying, salting, and fermentation, were essential, yet limited in effectiveness. Food sharing among kin or neighbors provided temporary relief, though such generosity could be constrained by the absolute scarcity of resources. Rural households often relied upon supplementary foraging, hunting or fishing to bridge gaps, while urban populations might attempt to secure odd jobs or small-scale trade to obtain sustenance. These measures were labor-intensive, risky, and frequently insufficient, demonstrating the precariousness of survival during the lean months. The social consequences of hunger were significant. Scarcity heightened tension within households and communities, sometimes provoking disputes over property, resources, or labor contributions. The stress of insufficient food intensified the experience of labor, the imposition of authority, and the vulnerability of the weakest members, including children and the elderly. Hunger was both a personal and communal trial, a force shaping behavior, relationships, and the social hierarchy by exposing vulnerabilities and reinforcing dependence. Famine, while extreme, was never entirely absent from the experience of medieval life. Periodic crop failures, climate fluctuations, and localized shortages transformed the lean months from a predictable challenge into existential crises. Historical records from the early 14th century describe widespread deprivation in regions such as northern Europe, where cold summers, late frosts, or excessive rainfall decimated harvests. The inability to store or transport food efficiently compounded the impact of these events, leaving communities exposed and forcing desperate measures. Families might consume seeds intended for the next planting, reduce portions for adults to preserve children, or rely upon foraging in increasingly marginal environments. Mortality rates rose during such periods, and the psychological weight of repeated scarcity was inescapable. The cyclical nature of hunger also interacted with other dimensions of medieval life. Disease, already a persistent threat, was exacerbated by malnutrition, while labor and apprenticeship continued regardless of physical depletion. Women bore the additional burden of managing households, rationing supplies, and ensuring children survived the most vulnerable periods. Social obligations, religious expectations, and feudal duties persisted even in the face of hunger, creating an environment in which endurance was as necessary as skill, vigilance, or obedience. Seasonal scarcity also reinforced cultural and religious rituals. Feasts, festivals, and holy days were often planned in relation to agricultural cycles, providing temporary relief or commemoration of abundance. Yet even these moments were tinged with anxiety. The imminence of the next lean month served as a constant reminder that sustenance was provisional and that prosperity was fleeting. Social cohesion, moral instruction, and communal support were embedded within these cycles, but the structural pressures of scarcity remained unavoidable. The experience of the lean months illuminates the interconnectedness of labor, environment, and social organization in the medieval world. Hunger was not merely an occasional crisis, but a recurring framework within which people structured their work, family life, and survival strategies. It emphasized endurance, reinforced hierarchy, and heightened awareness of mortality, shaping the physical, psychological, and social fabric of society. Those who endured the cycles of scarcity internalized patterns of planning, rationing, and adaptation that would define their lives and those of their descendants. The relentless pressures of hunger, coupled with malnutrition and overwork, created ideal conditions for the proliferation of disease. Bodies weakened by scarcity were more susceptible to infections, parasites, and epidemic illnesses that spread with alarming speed through communities already living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The transition from the seasons of hunger to the spread of disease was seamless. Scarcity intensified vulnerability, and illness compounded the already overwhelming pressures of subsistence, labor, and social expectation. In the 14th century, the pursuit of knowledge existed primarily as a luxury reserved for a small, privileged minority, and for the vast majority of people, access to learning was almost entirely absent. The transmission of information was slow, localized, and fragile, constrained by the scarcity of books, the exclusivity of education, and the pervasive demands of labor and survival. Monastic institutions, cathedral schools, and universities served as the primary repositories of knowledge, yet even these were isolated, their learning heavily focused on theology, philosophy, and classical texts. For most peasants, artisans, and laborers, life was so dominated by physical toil, subsistence labor, and the cycles of hunger and disease that intellectual pursuits were nearly impossible, relegated to distant glimmers of awareness that might occasionally reach them through rumor, traveling clerics, or rare encounters with written texts. Books themselves were precious and rare objects. Manuscripts were painstakingly copied by hand on parchment, a labor-intensive process that limited both quantity and accessibility. Illuminated texts, religious scriptures, and scholarly works were housed in monasteries, churches, and the private collections of wealthy nobles. Their value was immense, and the act of reading was bound by both social status and institutional authority. For the majority of the population, literacy was not only uncommon, but often irrelevant to the practicalities of daily life. Knowing how to sow, harvest, spin, bake, or tend animals was far more necessary for survival than the ability to read Latin or interpret philosophical treatises. The written word therefore existed largely as a distant and untouchable element of cultural life, its influence indirect and mediated through oral communication, ritual, or symbolic representation. The slow spread of learning was also shaped by geography and infrastructure. Rural communities were isolated, physically removed from centers of scholarship, trade, and administration. Roads were rudimentary, travel was arduous, and communication between towns, villages, and monastic centers was slow and unreliable. Knowledge, whether practical or theoretical, moved at the pace of human bodies and animals, constrained by the limitations of transportation, seasonal conditions, and social networks. This isolation reinforced the perception that intellectual resources were distant, almost otherworldly, and that the practical demands of survival left little room for contemplation, inquiry, or structured education. Education, when available, was highly selective. Boys in urban centers or children of wealthy families might receive instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious doctrine, while girls, if educated, were often confined to domestic training and religious literacy. Monastic schools trained clerics, scholars, and future administrators, focusing on Latin, theology, and canonical law. Universities such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford were beginning to flourish, but their influence was circumscribed by accessibility, language, and social barriers. For ordinary people, learning remained largely experiential. Knowledge was transmitted orally, through observation, and by hands-on apprenticeship, creating a practical rather than theoretical understanding of the world. Even the glimmers of knowledge that filtered to common people were often mediated by authority. Clerics, traveling scholars, and merchants could convey information about distant events, religious instruction, or techniques of craft and trade. Yet this transmission was uneven, selective, and often filtered through layers of interpretation. Stories of distant lands, new methods of cultivation, or innovations in craftsmanship traveled slowly, arriving sometimes years after they were first observed or practiced elsewhere. In this way, the circulation of knowledge was less a continuous expansion than a patchwork of isolated insights, perceived intermittently rather than systematically absorbed. The scarcity of knowledge was compounded by economic pressures. Those engaged in subsistence labor, craft, or trade had neither the time nor the resources to pursue learning. Every hour spent away from labor carried an immediate cost, whether in lost productivity, diminished household stability, or potential penalties from lords and guilds. Survival demanded constant attention to the tangible and immediate: tending crops, caring for livestock, maintaining household tasks, and navigating social and religious obligations. Intellectual pursuits were subordinated to physical necessity, ensuring that curiosity and study were luxuries rather than expectations. Religious instruction served as the primary conduit of knowledge for the majority. Sermons, prayers, and rituals communicated moral, social, and historical frameworks, shaping understanding of the world through allegory, doctrine, and the authority of the Church. These lessons were often fragmentary and framed by theological priorities, emphasizing obedience, piety, and communal cohesion over empirical observation or critical inquiry. Yet, even within these constraints, they provided continuity, structure, and context for individuals living in otherwise uncertain, demanding, and perilous environments. The isolation of the majority from formal knowledge also reinforced social hierarchies. Literacy and access to texts created a divide between clergy, scholars, and elites on one side and peasants, laborers, and urban workers on the other. This divide was both practical and symbolic. Those with access to written knowledge could navigate legal systems, record transactions, and interpret religious doctrine in ways unavailable to the majority. Ordinary people relied upon intermediaries to translate, interpret, and enforce knowledge, further embedding dependence upon authority and reinforcing the stratified nature of medieval society. Despite these limitations, small communities developed informal knowledge networks. Skills related to agriculture, herbal medicine, animal husbandry, and craft were transmitted orally and experientially, creating localized expertise. Even the illiterate could wield practical wisdom with remarkable sophistication. Yet, this knowledge remained constrained by immediate context, experience, and environment. Broader intellectual developments, scientific observation, and philosophical discourse were largely inaccessible, leaving the average person distant from the more abstract and expansive currents of learning emerging elsewhere. This landscape of scarce education and slow intellectual diffusion contributed to a society in which superstition, rumor, and authority exerted disproportionate influence. Without widespread literacy or access to books, beliefs were often shaped by tradition, religious interpretation, and the testimony of local authorities. Practical skills and moral lessons were intertwined with ritual, symbolism, and communal memory, creating a framework of understanding that was conservative, localized, and resistant to rapid change. In this sense, the distant glimmers of knowledge were not merely rare but fragile, subject to interruption, reinterpretation, and loss. The limited circulation of knowledge left communities vulnerable to the consequences of ignorance in health, agriculture, and governance. Understanding of disease, nutrition, sanitation, and crop management was constrained by observation, anecdote, and inherited practices, with little access to broader insights or empirical methods. The intersection of scarcity, labor demands, and social control reinforced a pattern in which survival, rather than inquiry or innovation, was the primary concern, preparing the stage for the next dimension of medieval existence, the constant, often violent intrusion of conflict, feuds, and warfare into daily life. In the 14th century, the boundary between the known and the unknown was fraught with dread, and the average person's understanding of the world was suffused with superstition, fear, and an intense reliance upon unseen forces to explain the relentless hardships of life. Misfortune, illness, failed harvests, and accidents were rarely interpreted as random or natural events. Instead, they were frequently framed within spiritual or supernatural contexts. Witchcraft, curses, divine punishment, and malevolent spirits were woven into the fabric of daily understanding, creating a universe in which the invisible exerted constant pressure, shaping behavior, social relationships, and the interpretation of suffering. The fear of unseen forces was pervasive, a psychological weight that paralleled the physical demands of labor, scarcity, and disease, and one that profoundly influenced social and personal conduct. The attribution of misfortune to supernatural causes was both pervasive and socially reinforced. Illness, for example, was often interpreted not merely as a physical ailment, but as evidence of moral failing, divine displeasure, or the work of malevolent individuals. Crop failure, livestock disease, or accidents were similarly imbued with moral or supernatural significance, suggesting that the world was not governed solely by natural laws but by forces that could be influenced through ritual, prayer, or social sanction. In this sense, superstition operated as a framework for understanding uncertainty, providing explanations where empirical knowledge was limited, and offering a form of agency, however tentative, in the face of existential vulnerability. Witchcraft and curses occupied a particularly potent place in the collective imagination. Individuals who were perceived as different, women who lived alone, the elderly, the socially marginalized, or those with unusual knowledge of herbs or remedies, were often suspected of wielding invisible influence. Misfortune attributed to their intervention could provoke fear, suspicion, and social sanction. Communities engaged in informal surveillance of behavior, interpreting accidents, illness, or unexpected setbacks as potential evidence of hidden malice. The consequences for those accused of witchcraft could be severe, ranging from social ostracism to violence or execution, reinforcing the social function of superstition as a mechanism for controlling behavior and maintaining cohesion in times of uncertainty. Divine punishment was a constant explanatory framework for suffering. The pervasive influence of the Church, combined with the limited scientific understanding of natural phenomena, created an environment in which misfortune was interpreted as evidence of moral or spiritual deficiency. Natural disasters, famine or disease, could be seen as a sign of collective sin, prompting ritual observance, penance, or the seeking of indulgences. Clerics preached that the invisible consequences of human behavior extended beyond the material world, teaching that adherence to religious norms was essential to avoiding calamity. Fear of divine retribution reinforced obedience, moral conformity, and social control, embedding psychological pressure into the daily experience of labor, domestic management, and interpersonal conduct. Superstition also shaped personal and household practices in more subtle ways. Amulets, charms, and ritual gestures were common, employed to protect against misfortune or attract favor. Herbal remedies, divination, and symbolic acts reflected an understanding of causality that blended observation, experience, and mystical interpretation. These practices were not uniformly irrational within the context of medieval life. They represented practical, culturally accepted methods for negotiating uncertainty, demonstrating the human need to assert control over an unpredictable and often hostile environment. Fear of the unseen extended to the natural environment as well. Storms, eclipses, unusual weather patterns, and other phenomena were imbued with symbolic meaning, interpreted as messages or warnings. Communities responded through ritual, prayer, or adjustment of labor schedules, attempting to align human activity with the perceived intentions of divine or supernatural forces. Such responses were deeply integrated into the social rhythm, shaping agricultural practice, festival timing, and the sequencing of daily labor. Knowledge and experience were filtered through the lens of supernatural interpretation, producing a worldview in which uncertainty, danger, and the unseen were inseparable from material existence. Social relationships were mediated by this climate of fear. Suspicion, gossip, and the attribution of misfortune to others shaped community dynamics, reinforcing both moral codes and social hierarchies. Individuals navigated a complex web of perceived influences, cautious in speech, behavior, and association, aware that personal misfortune might be attributed to hidden forces beyond their control. Superstition was thus both explanatory and regulatory, providing mechanisms for interpreting misfortune, while simultaneously enforcing social norms and hierarchies. The psychological burden of living under constant fear of the unseen cannot be overstated. Beyond the physical exhaustion of labor, scarcity, and disease, individuals contended with a mental landscape saturated with anxiety. Every failure, illness, or accident carried moral, social, and spiritual implications. Children internalized these lessons from an early age, learning that obedience, vigilance, and ritual observance were essential to safety and survival. Adults navigated a world in which prudence and caution were inseparable from existential security, and where unseen forces exerted pressure comparable to the tangible hardships of life. This interplay between superstition, fear, and daily hardship created a society in which suffering was not merely endured, but actively interpreted through a moral and supernatural lens. Knowledge, labor, hunger, and disease were continuously reframed as reflections of invisible forces, reinforcing the idea that human action was inseparable from spiritual consequence. Understanding life through this lens shaped decision-making, labor allocation, social interaction, and the very perception of reality, producing a culture of vigilance, moral attentiveness, and apprehension that paralleled the physical endurance demanded by the world itself. The persistent fear of unseen forces, finally, intersected with the experience of illness and misfortune. Disease, malnutrition, injury, and the unpredictable events of daily life were not merely physical phenomena. They were interpreted as indicators of divine displeasure, malevolent magic, or social transgression. This perception amplified the social and psychological impact of hardship, layering fear upon scarcity, vulnerability upon labor, and anxiety upon physical exhaustion. The resulting environment was one in which survival depended not only on skill, strength, and endurance, but also on careful negotiation of moral, spiritual, and social expectations. From the shadowy fears of witchcraft and curses, one naturally moved to the tangible isolation imposed by illness, injury, and misfortune. Communities recognized both the necessity and the danger of proximity to disease, creating forms of social exclusion and quarantine that compounded physical suffering with loneliness, vulnerability, and social marginalization. In this way, the unseen, whether imagined or epidemiological, continued to shape life, linking psychological pressure with material reality, and bridging the next phase of medieval hardship, the isolation of illness and the compounded effects of misfortune. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe had been enduring generations of hardship, harsh seasons, famine, laborious toil, and the psychological weight of superstition and social control. It was in this context of sustained vulnerability that the Black Death began its slow, inexorable march across the continent, introducing a level of disruption and mortality previously unimaginable. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, traveled along trade routes, rivers, and roads, often invisible to those who would soon be engulfed by its consequences. Its arrival was not instantaneous, nor its effect confined to a single locality. It moved gradually, insidiously, leaving a trail of fear, death, and social unraveling in its wake. For the communities already weakened by malnutrition, overwork, and endemic disease, the Black Death represented an almost unimaginable acceleration of existing hardships. Those who might have survived a year of poor harvests, or endured the strain of labor under strict guild or feudal obligations, were suddenly confronted by a pathogen that offered no distinction between young and old, rich and poor, urban and rural. Symptoms were swift and terrifying: fever, chills, buboes, vomiting, and relentless fatigue, leading in many cases to death within days. Knowledge of its causes was minimal. Rumors abounded, from divine wrath to poisoned wells, and the invisibility of the disease intensified fear and superstition. The psychological impact of the approaching pestilence was profound. Communities, accustomed to managing scarcity and labor, were suddenly thrust into a new dimension of vulnerability. Anxiety intensified as news traveled slowly but steadily, carried by travelers, merchants, and returning soldiers. Villagers watched neighbors fall ill and die, sometimes without understanding why or how, and the pattern of mortality seemed arbitrary and incomprehensible. In many regions, people fled urban centers, abandoned their homes, or attempted protective measures grounded in ritual, superstition, or improvised quarantine. The invisible nature of the threat rendered customary social, religious, and labor practices largely irrelevant, creating both panic and fatalism. The plague also interacted with pre-existing physical and economic vulnerabilities. Malnourished populations, exhausted from continuous labor and periodic famine, were particularly susceptible to infection. Compromised immune systems, coupled with poor sanitation and crowded living conditions, allowed the bacterium to spread rapidly. Rural villages, often isolated but poorly equipped for sustained outbreaks, experienced devastating mortality rates. Urban centers, densely populated with narrow streets, inadequate waste management, and constant human interaction, became epicenters of transmission, amplifying fear and accelerating social collapse. Social responses were varied and often improvised. Religious institutions attempted to offer guidance, processions, and prayers, interpreting the plague as a manifestation of divine judgment. Flagellants moved through towns in ritual self-punishment, seeking to appease a wrathful god. Municipal authorities attempted quarantines and cordons, though these measures were inconsistently applied and frequently ineffective. Communities relied on a mixture of superstition, traditional remedies, and the scant empirical knowledge available. Yet these strategies could do little to stem the relentless advance of the disease. The death toll was staggering. Entire households were wiped out, leaving fields untilled, workshops abandoned, and families disbanded. Labor shortages intensified existing economic pressures, as the loss of workers disrupted agricultural cycles, trade, and artisanal production. Survivors, confronted by a landscape of death and abandonment, faced difficult choices whether to continue labor, attempt relocation, or seek spiritual or material consolation in a society suddenly unmoored. The plague did not merely kill, it destabilized the rhythms of daily life, undermining the social, economic, and psychological structures that had sustained communities through centuries of hardship. In addition to the immediate mortality, the Black Death amplified social and psychological pressures. Survivors navigated grief, fear, and isolation, often with little support. Children orphaned by the disease, widows, and the elderly faced extreme vulnerability. Communities fragmented, as traditional patterns of mutual assistance were strained or overwhelmed. The disruption of burial practices, public gatherings, and markets further compounded a sense of existential instability, reinforcing the perception that the ordinary structures of life, labor, family, community, were fragile and impermanent. The economic consequences were equally severe. Agricultural production declined sharply, leading to further food shortages in affected regions. Artisans, merchants, and laborers were reduced in number, creating temporary disruptions in trade and craft production. The scarcity of labor, however, would later shift bargaining power for survivors. Yet in the immediate aftermath, the plague compounded existing scarcity and vulnerability. Market networks, supply chains, and transport systems all faced interruption, illustrating the delicate interdependence of medieval society and the ease with which it could be unbalanced by biological catastrophe. The spread of the Black Death also illuminated the limitations of contemporary knowledge and medical practice. Physicians, herbalists, and clerics could offer little beyond ritual, rudimentary remedies, and moral guidance. Observations of contagion, sanitation, or hygiene were largely anecdotal, and empirical understanding of disease transmission was absent. This absence reinforced fear and superstition, as people sought explanations in divine wrath, malevolent neighbors, or cosmic imbalance, further shaping the cultural and psychological landscape in which survival was intertwined with belief, obedience, and ritual precaution. Even as the plague claimed lives with relentless efficiency, it highlighted the fragility of social order. Authorities struggled to maintain compliance with taxes, labor obligations, and legal norms when communities were depopulated or disorganized. Feudal and urban hierarchies faced unprecedented strain, as the demographic collapse undermined the mechanisms of control that had previously ensured continuity of labor and obedience. Ordinary people, confronted by mortality on an unprecedented scale, were forced to navigate both physical survival and social adaptation in a society suddenly destabilized by forces far beyond their control. From the slow approach and terrifying impact of the Black Death, society inevitably moved toward a broader collapse of daily structures, labor routines, and social hierarchies. The relentless mortality, combined with pre-existing scarcity, superstition, and disease, created a world in which the familiar rhythms of work, ritual, and social life were disrupted, leaving communities fragmented and ordinary life uncertain. The arrival of the Great Pestilence set the stage for a final unraveling, a collapse of daily existence that would reshape the psychological, economic, and social landscape of the 14th century. In the wake of the Black Death, the medieval landscape was transformed in ways that were immediately visible and deeply unsettling. All villages that had once thrummed with labor, ritual, and the mundane rhythms of daily life now stood hollowed and silent, their cottages abandoned, their streets overgrown, and their fields untended. The population collapse left not merely a numerical deficit, but a profound disruption of social, economic, and psychological continuity, producing a world in which the ordinary markers of existence, work, family, community, had been stripped away, leaving only the skeletal outlines of what had been. The emptiness of these villages was both literal and symbolic. Homes that had sheltered generations were now dark and empty, the thatched roofs sagging under neglect, the wooden beams weathered by exposure to wind and rain. Hearths once central to domestic life were cold and abandoned, chimneys void of smoke, and the pungent odor of decay sometimes replacing the familiar sense of cooking and daily living. Gardens and small plots of cultivated land, which had provided sustenance and routine, were overgrown with weeds, brambles and wild grasses, leaving a landscape that looked simultaneously familiar and alien. The silence was palpable. The chatter of neighbors, the crow of roosters, and the lowing of cattle were replaced by a stillness that seemed to press down upon the land itself. Fields and commons, once worked daily by the rhythm of human labor, now bore the marks of sudden neglect. Crops rotted in place, livestock wandered untended or perished, and fences and hedgerows fell into disrepair. The careful organization that had structured agricultural life, rotation, planting and harvest, was disrupted, and nature in its persistent cycles reclaimed spaces once tightly managed by human hands. Piles of uncollected firewood, dilapidated barns and scattered tools testified to the abrupt cessation of ordinary routines, as if the very act of survival had been suspended in time. Social structures, already strained by famine, superstition and disease, were further destabilized. Villagers who survived the plague found themselves alone or in drastically reduced households. Kinship networks, central to emotional support, labor, and economic survival, were fragmented, leaving survivors to navigate grief, fear, and uncertainty with little assistance. The absence of communal activities, markets, religious festivals, and labor-sharing arrangements further compounded isolation. Ordinary rituals, once anchoring the passage of time and reinforcing social cohesion, became sporadic or impossible, producing a psychological landscape of emptiness alongside the physical devastation. Economic life collapsed alongside demographic decline. Artisan workshops, mills and markets were abandoned or operated at reduced capacity, depriving communities of trade, goods, and services. The shortage of labor meant that even those who survived faced a paradox. Fields remained untilled, crops unharvested, and labor-intensive industries stalled, yet the relative scarcity of workers would in subsequent years elevate wages and bargaining power for those who endured. In the immediate aftermath, however, the disruption produced scarcity, disorder, and pervasive uncertainty, emphasizing the fragility of systems that had previously seemed permanent. The psychological and emotional toll of depopulated villages was immense. Survivors contended with the specter of lost neighbors, family members, and friends, navigating grief compounded by the absence of customary social support. The persistent presence of death, in unburied bodies, neglected cemeteries, and abandoned homes, created a landscape haunted not by spirits alone, but by memory and absence. Children, often orphaned, faced survival in a world in which the ordinary networks of care, guidance, and protection had been dramatically thinned. Adults, meanwhile, had to reconcile both the practical demands of survival and the existential weight of living in a society suddenly rendered sparse and fragile. Religious life, too, was affected. Churches, though physically intact in many regions, were diminished in their congregations. Clergy struggled to minister to dispersed populations, administer sacraments, and provide guidance amid widespread mortality. The moral and spiritual frameworks that had structured daily existence were challenged by the scale and seeming randomness of death. The notion that adherence to ritual, prayer, or moral conduct could safeguard against catastrophe was undermined, leaving communities grappling with doubt, fear, and a heightened awareness of human vulnerability. Over time, the landscape itself absorbed the traces of this depopulation. Roads became less traveled, bridges fell into disrepair, and the connectivity that had supported trade, travel, and communication was weakened. Forests encroached upon fields and pastures, and abandoned settlements became partially reabsorbed by the natural environment. In many regions, centuries-old patterns of human settlement were disrupted, leaving a legacy of abandoned villages, place names, and historical memory that echoed the enormity of loss. The emptiness of the land mirrored the emptiness of social and domestic life, creating a profound sense of stillness and absence that was as physical as it was psychological. Yet even in this stark desolation, the resilience of survivors began to emerge. Those who remained had to adapt to new social, economic, and environmental realities. Labor shortages forced changes in agricultural practice, domestic arrangements, and labor contracts. Land once tied to communal or feudal structures was often consolidated, abandoned, or leased differently. Guilds, markets, and craft traditions slowly reconstituted themselves in reduced form, while survivors leveraged scarcity to negotiate better conditions, higher wages, or greater autonomy. The immediate desolation was followed, in subsequent decades, by gradual recovery, though the shadow of the catastrophe remained embedded in memory, landscape, and cultural practice. The hollowed villages thus became emblematic of the broader transformations wrought by the century. They illustrated the fragility of human systems, the interdependence of labor, social cohesion, and mortality, and the pervasive vulnerability of ordinary life in a pre-modern world. The silent homes, untended fields, and empty streets were not merely consequences of disease, but of centuries of cumulative hardship, intensified by famine, superstition, labor demands, and social inequality. The 14th century, in its combination of environmental, social, and biological pressures, revealed the extraordinary endurance required for survival and the persistent shadow of mortality that defined daily existence. From the empty villages and silent fields, the historical narrative moves naturally to a contemplation of the enduring legacies of this era. How did the weight of these centuries, the combination of labor, scarcity, disease, and social control, shape not only those who lived through them, but the structures, attitudes, and memory of societies that followed? The final point of this story considers the long shadow cast by these experiences, tracing how survival, adaptation, and memory were woven into the very fabric of post-plague Europe and beyond. Even after the catastrophic events of the mid-14th century, the relentless seasons, the burdens of labor, the weight of superstition, and the unprecedented toll of the Black Death, life, in its stubborn persistence, continued. Villages slowly repopulated, fields were tilled once more, and workshops reopened, though the contours of society had been irreversibly altered by centuries of hardship and by the mass mortality that hollowed entire communities. Survivors, bearing the scars of famine, disease, and loss, adapted to new circumstances while remaining bound to the cyclical rhythms that had always defined human existence: the seasons, the demands of labor, and the obligations of faith. Life in the 1300s, though transformed, retained an almost ritualistic continuity, a testament to human resilience in the face of recurring adversity. The recovery of population was gradual, constrained by ongoing mortality, the persistent vulnerability of women and children, and the limitations of medical knowledge. Families rebuilt households slowly, relying on kin networks, communal labor, and adaptive strategies learned over generations of scarcity. Agricultural practices evolved in response to the demographic collapse. Fields that had once been cultivated intensively were consolidated, crop rotations adjusted, and livestock managed with greater care. Labor shortages, while tragic, allowed those who survived to negotiate more favorable terms with lords and guilds, shifting the dynamics of obligation and authority, yet the essential demands of daily subsistence remained unaltered. The labor required to plant, harvest, maintain livestock, and provide for households was relentless, offering little reprieve from the cyclical pressures that had always governed medieval life. The rhythms of faith continued to structure the lives of survivors. Religious observance, ritual practice, and moral instruction remained central, offering solace, explanation, and a framework for understanding suffering. Churches, monasteries, and parish institutions adapted to the changed population, providing guidance and continuity amid disruption. Pilgrimages, feast days, and seasonal rituals persisted, though their character was inevitably shaped by the experience of loss and mortality. The spiritual life of communities reflected both endurance and transformation. Piety was informed by grief, vigilance by experience, and devotion often intertwined with a heightened awareness of mortality and the fragility of existence. Economic life, though altered, gradually resumed its cadence. Craftsmanship, trade, and markets slowly recovered as artisans, merchants, and laborers returned or adapted to new social circumstances. Guilds reasserted standards, apprentices resumed training, and production of essential goods resumed. though often with fewer hands and altered expectations. Agricultural production, too, gradually increased, tempered by the recognition that scarcity remained a constant companion. The interplay between labor, scarcity, and survival continued to shape decisions, and the memory of prior catastrophe informed strategies for resilience, conservation, and adaptation. Social relationships and community structures, though scarred, proved remarkably enduring. Survivors reconstituted households, rebuilt villages, and reconstructed networks of mutual assistance. Practices of shared labor, cooperative farming, and communal protection persisted, often reinforced by the collective memory of past calamities. Villages, families, and neighbors navigated grief, suspicion, and hope with a pragmatism honed over generations, learning to balance caution with cooperation, ritual with necessity, and survival with the maintenance of social cohesion. Life, though shadowed by previous suffering, continued with a continuity that both reassured and constrained the human spirit. The persistence of life also reflected adaptation to environmental, social, and economic realities. Survivors innovated where possible, in improving methods of cultivation, adjusting diets to seasonal availability, and refining household management to conserve resources. While superstition and ritual continued to shape understanding, practical knowledge gained through experience informed daily decisions, from crop selection to hygiene, and from trade to domestic organization. The interplay between inherited wisdom and immediate necessity underscored the resilience of ordinary people, whose survival depended on both observation and the gradual transmission of practical expertise. Children, born into a world shaped by mortality, scarcity, and labor, learned early the rhythms of work, obedience, and adaptation. Apprenticeships resumed, domestic responsibilities were assumed, and young people participated actively in sustaining households and communities. Childhood, though still fraught with risk, continued as a stage of preparation for the recurring demands of life, labor, and survival. The experience of loss, coupled with communal memory of prior disasters, instilled a cautious awareness of mortality, while simultaneously teaching the routines, skills, and rhythms that ensured continuity. The psychological persistence of life was mirrored in cultural memory and expression. Stories, rituals, and oral histories preserved the memory of famine, disease, and hardship, passing them to successive generations as warnings, lessons, or moral frameworks. Religious instruction, communal storytelling, and the observance of anniversaries of feasts, deaths, and disasters reinforced a collective awareness of vulnerability, shaping behavior, expectation, and understanding. Even as physical life continued, it was framed by the memory of scarcity, mortality, and the trials that had defined the century, ensuring that knowledge and experience endured alongside survival. Ultimately, the persistence of life in the 1300s was an interplay between continuity and change. The cycles of labor, faith, and seasonal survival endured, providing structure and stability, yet they were inseparable from the memory of famine, disease, and social disruption. Communities adapted, individuals endured, and society recalibrated in response to the pressures of a century marked by relentless hardship. The resilience of life lay not in triumph over adversity, but in the measured, daily perseverance required to navigate a world of scarcity, mortality, and moral expectation. From the emptiness of abandoned villages, to the gradual repopulation of fields, from the disruption of social hierarchies, to the enduring structures of labor and faith, the 14th century illustrates the remarkable capacity of human life to persist even under sustained relentless pressure. The century's hardships, harsh seasons, laborious toil, superstition, disease, and mortality left indelible marks on society, yet life continued. People survived, adapted, remembered, and rebuilt, tethered to the same fundamental rhythms that had defined existence for centuries, demonstrating that even amid profound suffering, the persistence of life endures, shaped by loss but never extinguished. And so, as the centuries passed, and the echoes of the 1300s faded into memory, the lives of those who endured, who labored and survived amid hardship, famine, disease, and fear, continued to ripple forward. Their fields were replanted, their villages rebuilt, their routines re-established, and yet the memory of their struggles remained, embedded in the rhythms of labor, faith and community that would carry humanity through the generations. The weight of history is not only measured in wars fought, plagues endured, or famines survived, but in the quiet persistence of life itself, in the daily acts of tending, nurturing, and continuing despite adversity. Each small gesture, each humble survival, shaped the world for those who came after, leaving behind lessons of endurance, adaptation, and the resilience of ordinary people. Now, as your eyes grow heavy, and your mind drifts with the slow turning of seasons long past, let yourself settle into the calm rhythm of history. Feel the passage of centuries like a soft wind over the fields, carrying away the fear, hunger, and toil, leaving only the quiet pulse of life persisting, ever steady, even in the face of unimaginable challenges. Let this reflection ease you into rest, carrying you gently through the night, beneath the same stars that once shone over the villages and fields of the 1300s, as life continued, quietly, unbroken, and enduring. Sleep now, in the soft embrace of history's vast, unhurried rhythm.